planning permission for the construction, operation and decommissioning of a solar farm with the capability to export and import up to 49.9 megawatts of electricity at any one time, comprising the installation of ground-mounted fixed solar panels, associated energy storage and ancillary development, including customer and DNO substation, inverter and transformer stations, fencing, security cameras, landscape planting and associated works, including grid connection at land northeast of Wandon End, North Hertfordshire, LU2 8PS. Can I remind everyone to make sure that their phones and other electronic devices are either on silent or switched off? This is the third day of the inquiry. So far, we've dealt with topic 1 on landscape and made a start on the council's planning evidence, which we will continue with today before hearing the appellant's evidence on the same matter. Before we start, there are a number of housekeeping matters I just want to run through. And I also am aware that there's a third party who wishes to speak. I'll just run through these housekeeping matters. And then if you don't mind, Mr. Hughes, rather than disturb you from there, I'm going to suggest maybe he could come up and speak from this table next to you, Sarah, if that's all right. Just so in terms of housekeeping matters, I just wanted to check with the council. I should have checked yesterday. In terms of INQ1, you were going to look at it and check you were okay. Given you've been using it, I'm kind of assuming you are, but I wanted to just check.
Yes, so my understanding is that today Mr. Reynolds and Mr. Morris are going to sit down and work through the table to ensure that it's completely accurate. You'll recall, ma'am,
Yes.
yesterday that Mr. Morris identified that in relation at least to the table 3,
Yes,
the time periods are not accurate. There are other issues, I believe, like that, but the 2 witnesses are going to work through it today. So you should
hopefully
have
get an agreed
document
yes.
that the council is satisfied is accurate in all respects.
Yes.
Hopefully before the end of the inquiry.
Right, super, thank you. Another matter is that I had an email from the office just to tell me that that the residents group had sent in the copy of their presentation, and so what they actually said, as opposed to the slides, and also some details of where the other solar farm is that they referred to. I've asked the office to send them on to both parties, so you're aware of that. And I've also asked Sarah just to make contact with them to check whether they're want to come on the site visit as well. I'm getting a nod from the back, so I think they do. But just to clarify that, and because obviously we need to factor in arrangements for that nearer the time. Is there any other housekeeping matters people need to raise with me? No. Thank you very much.
Can I just say that Planning Control Committee this evening, so we need to leave the chamber by 5:30.
Right. Yeah. No problem. Thank you. I think we've been managing to do that anyway. Yeah. Can I invite this gentleman? I know you want to come up and speak. So if you'd like to come up to this table here and just introduce yourself to us.
You don't have to be too close.
Close. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak at this hearing. I'm Roger Lovegrove and I represent Decarbonising Letchworth. We used to be called Transition Town Letchworth, but we've changed it to that. We are generally in favour of solar farms, but do not have a particular view on where they are, on their location, or in fact the number of solar farms, except to say that we would really like North Hertfordshire to become self-sufficient in energy, which means we need a fair number of solar farms. So we're in favour generally of solar farms. So I'd like to make 5 points. Point number 1, North Herts is generally short of locally generated electricity. There's no large gas, coal or nuclear power station very close to North Hertfordshire. There's lots of losses in the line and the grid has been so desperate they've actually put a small power station I think it's 20 to 30 megawatts just north of the swimming pool in Letchworth to keep the volts up and the power coming into this sort of quiet area of the country, electricity-wise. So North Arts is short of electricity, and more local farms help solve that problem. Second point, all the fields in the area, as I understand it, are of middling agricultural value. So if a farmer wants to make more money by having solar farms, why not, so be it. Solar panels, the third point, solar panels do not create brownfield sites as they can be readily removed. No soil is removed or added. It's very easy to remove them. Fourth point, energy technology is advancing very rapidly, and solar farms probably will not be required beyond, say, 2075. Fission and fusion techniques, including the use of helium-3, will kick in, and also solar panels are much more efficient if they're located in space. So the long-term expectation for solar farms is probably not good. The final point is about biodiversity. We were quite surprised to do some research and found that if it's well done, solar farms well managed with ecological considerations can host 3 times as many birds as nearby arable farmland. They're very good for endangered species along with butterflies, bumblebees, mammals, trees and plants. Also, the land beneath solar panels is increasingly being used for grazing sheep and livestock. Energy Minister Michael Shanks MP emphasises that solar power strengthens energy security while benefiting nature, farmers and local communities. So the findings challenge the idea that solar development comes at the expense of wildlife. Thank you. That's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Is there anyone? Do the council or anyone want to ask any questions? No. I've got no questions. Thank you very much for coming to give us your point of view.
It's probably nothing to do with what you're going to discuss this morning, but I think you need to keep a general overview on all this.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sorry, can I just confirm the gentleman's second name?
Lovegrove, wasn't it?
Thank you very much, Mr. Lovegrove.
So on that basis, Ms. Smith, would you like to start the cross-examination?
Thank you very much. Yes, I will. In terms of the documents we'll need, we have the National Planning Policy Framework.
Yep.
Core document 3.1.1, the officer report.
Yeah.
Core document 8.2.1. I'm not sure you'll find that online yet, Ma'am. Do we have a hard copy for the inspector? The landscape statement of common ground. We discovered this morning, rather late last night in my case, that it hadn't been uploaded, the landscape statement of common ground.
Right. I've got a copy. I've got a copy of that.
You've got a copy.
On my
Great.
computer. Let me, I'll just get it.
I'm not sure
You don't.
if it's not online.
It's called document 8.2.1. I'll see if
8.2.
you can have mine. Oh, I've got.
Well, at the appropriate time.
I'll
only lose it on this table.
Mr. Sharp can put it behind you so you don't disturb it and lose it. Then we've got core document 5.1.4, which is the Harlow appeal decision.
Yep.
6.5.2, which is the Greenbelt review.
Yep.
6.2.19, which is the MPPG on Greenbelt.
Yep.
6.2.2 and 6.2.3, which are EN1 and EN3.
Yep.
6.3.13 and 14, which are documents associated with Clean Power 2030.
6.3, sorry, which ones?
6.3, 13 and 14.
Yep.
And CD 5.1.7, Butterfly Lane appeal decision.
That's very nice, that, doesn't it? Butterfly Lane.
It
doesn't
does.
Not sure you'd recognise many butterflies knowing the lane well, but
Generally the case.
yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, very good morning to you, Mr. Hughes.
Good morning.
We know the focus of your evidence is reason for refusal 1. You rely on Mr. Reynolds' evidence
Indeed.
for reason for refusal 2. And reason for refusal 1 concerns forgive me, reason for refusal 1 concerns Greenbelt, and it considers that the benefits of the scheme are not capable of outweighing the harm to the Greenbelt and any other harm such that very special circumstances don't arise.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's correct.
The decision notice, of course, chronologically was issued in July 2024.
That's correct.
So doesn't engage with the issue of whether the site is grey belt because that policy didn't exist at that time.
That's correct.
The definition of grey belt is found within the National Planning Policy Framework in the glossary,
That's correct.
and that's on page 73 of the MPPF. And it's probably worth just turning that up.
Yes, I'm there.
And grey belt is defined there for both the purposes of plan making and decision taking as comprising previously developed land and or any other land that in either case does not strongly contribute to any of the purposes A, B or D in paragraph 143.
Incorrect.
Yeah.
Yes.
So grey belt land excludes land where the application of policies relating to the areas or assets in footnote 7, other than green belt, would provide a strong reason for refusing or restricting development.
Correct.
So having regard to that definition, one is looking to see whether the land, and that means the site for our purposes, yes,
Indeed.
is one which makes a strong contribution to the relevant greenbelt purposes set out there.
Indeed.
And to be clear, we agree that footnote policies do not indicate a strong reason for restricting development in this case.
That's a matter of common ground.
We agree that the site also does not strongly contribute to purposes B or D.
Correct.
For the purposes of the definition. So the issue between us is A. And when the officer considered the purposes in the report to committee in respect of the application, it was found that the site made a moderate contribution to purpose A, not a strong or a significant one. That's correct, isn't it?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. So if the officer was assessing the scheme today, applying that same reasoning, the officer would have identified that the site was grey belt. or
They
at
may
least
well
met
have,
the
yes.
met the grey belt definition. And if we turn up core document 3,
Well, sorry, just sorry. I think what they found was a moderate degree of harm to purpose A.
well, let's try and unpack that. Let's go to core document 3.3.1,
The committee report.
the committee
Yeah.
report. Yeah. And within that, to 4.8.22, which is on page 28 of the PDF.
Yep.
So when we reach there, we see this is the officer assessing greenbelt purposes essentially and the impact of the proposal on them. And what the officer says is that the applicant has assessed the proposed development for its potential harm to greenbelt purposes, considering the same criteria used for the assessment of development sites within the Greenbelt Review. In relation to the purposes of the Greenbelt, the following conclusions are reached by the applicant. And that goes through A to D. And sets out essentially what the applicant said in the documentation supporting the proposal. Then at 4.8.23, we see notwithstanding the above, officers consider that the application site makes a contribution to the purposes of the Greenbelt, as set out in the table below. The reasoning for this assessment is set out after the table. And what we see then is what the officer is doing is considering the contribution here. That's what the wording of 4.8.23 is. What's the contribution of the site to the purposes? Yeah.
Well, I think at 4.8.24, they say it lies within a parcel that makes a significant contribution to checking the sprawl. So I think they're explicitly dealing with the contribution there. I think the table refers to the degree of harm. That's where moderate comes from in the table.
Well, let's understand that. Can we take it stage by stage? Because we're dealing, this is what the officer says that they're doing at 4.8.23. We're assessing the contribution made as set out in the table below. So that's part of the assessment, the table below, yeah? That's what the officer says.
Well, that's what they say, but that's
Yeah.
not what the table identifies. The table identifies the degree of harm.
Yeah, we see the wording degree of harm, but reading the text that precedes it, putting that table in its context, that's what the officer's dealing with, the contribution.
Well, but that's not what the table sets out.
Well,
I mean, they explicitly at 8.2.4 deal with the contribution.
Well, let's stage by stage. 4.8.23 says that the table is dealing with the contribution. Yeah, you see that?
That's what it says, but the table doesn't.
Yeah. And then the table says degree of harm. So the
Yeah.
inspector will have to read that in its context and try and understand what the officer is saying here. But on purpose A, we see this to check the unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas, and the effect is an element of urban sprawl to Luton due to close proximity, but different character compared to built-up development. You see that?
That's what the officer says, yeah.
Yeah. And then that is said to cause a moderate degree of harm.
Correct.
And the reasoning that follows, sorry, forgive me, just to pick up on another point in the table. When we get to C, we can see safeguard the countryside from encroachment. We see the effect, a textual analysis of that, and a significant degree of harm set out in the final column. So there's a contrast there between what the officer is saying the effect on purpose A is and the effect on purpose C.
And I think the reason why I distinguish the harm in table 1 in terms of purpose A is that it's referring to the form of development and not the contribution of the land to the purpose. And that's the distinction in terms of the contribution. It's about the existing site and land and its contribution to purpose A. The harm is referring to the impact of the development in that parcel or on that site to the purpose. So they're different components. So I don't think you can translate the harm in the table to assessing the officer's view on the contribution of the land for the purposes of purpose A and the grey belt analysis that would inform an outcome from that.
Help me with this. When we're assessing the contribution of a parcel of land that it makes to the greenbelt purposes, the nature of the scheme proposed is relevant to that assessment, isn't it?
No,
You think not?
no, because it's the parcel of land. The purpose is about the contribution of the purpose of the land to that purpose.
Okay, we're going to come and have a look at that, but I'm going to note there that your stance is that the land has to be looked at almost in a way, a vacuum that ignores the nature of the development that's proposed on it to understand its contribution to the greenbelt purposes.
Yes,
Yeah.
the point in terms of grey belt land is not allied to the form of the development. It's the land that's important. And if we go back to the definition, it doesn't refer in the definition in the glossary to the impact of the form of development. It's the contribution of the land to the purpose.
Yeah. So your assessment entirely excludes any consideration of the scheme that's proposed on this land.
For the purposes of whether it's grey belt,
Yeah.
I'm assessing the contribution of the land to the purpose.
Okay, all right. That's a really helpful way to understand your approach to how you've come at this question. Let's carry on just looking through the text that's included here, because at 4.8.24, when the officer says that the site lies within parcel of land 2 that makes a significant contribution to checking the sprawl of Luton, and so on, that's a conclusion that's taken directly from the Greenbelt Review, isn't it?
Well, it's consistent with the Greenbelt Review, yeah.
It's saying parcel 2 is what's recorded as making a significant contribution to checking the sprawl of Luton. It's not providing a judgment about the site specifically. It's saying
No.
this is what the Greenbelt assessment says. Agreed?
Yeah, and I think to be complete, also parcel 2F, the sub parcel,
Yeah.
has the same outcome.
Yeah. And then when we go down to 4.8.26, what the officer says there is, it is noted that there will be buffers within the application site and around the proposed fields to be used for solar panels to protect residential amenity, as well as physical barriers in the form of Lower Road and Stony Lane between the site and site EL1, EL2, which limits the effect on the purpose of Greenbelt A to check unrestricted sprawl. A gap of Greenbelt will remain of about 700 metres to the corner of Luton, but once the housing allocation is built, the green space to the nearest urban edge will be reduced to around 150 to 200 metres, depending on the layout of the site allocation. And it was in that knowledge of the east of Luton coming forward that the officer went on to consider that the proposals would give rise to moderate adverse effect on the Greenbelt purpose of checking the sprawl of Luton.
Well, and also in that context that they considered parcel 2F to become more important in Greenbelt terms.
But what we see there, 4.8.28, is given the existing contribution of the site purposes A in the future plan for the area, officers consider that the proposal would have a moderately adverse effect on the Greenbelt purpose of checking the sprawl of Luton.
That was the officer's view.
Yeah, that's the final conclusion. And whether that's just a repeat of what's said at 4.8.23 in the table that follows, or whether one exercise is considering the contribution and one is considering the harm, that's going to be a matter for the inspector to resolve. But certainly in respect of the effect on purpose A, the officer considered it was no more than moderate.
That's correct. And,
Yeah.
And that follows their, as you say, it's a matter for the inspector, but 4.8.24, wherein they explicitly say it makes a significant contribution to checking the sprawl of Luton.
Yeah, that the parcel within the Greenbelt assessment. It's not a conclusion that's made in respect of the site specifically.
No,
is it?
that's fair.
We have to add that caveat. Now, of course, if the site did meet the definition of Greenbelt, one would have to go on to consider whether or not the scheme met the requirements of paragraph 155, and you helpfully
Sorry,
gave
I think you said green belt.
grey
Grey
belt.
belt, sorry.
Grey. My belt colours are confused. I apologise.
No.
If it's grey belt, we've got to go on to 155.
Of course, yeah.
And you helpfully gave evidence yesterday that if that exercise is required to be carried out, the scheme meets the requirements of that paragraph.
That's correct.
We agree, don't we, that for the purpose of paragraph 143 of the framework and purpose A, the large built-up area that we're dealing with is Luton.
Correct.
And while there is no definition of sprawl, paragraph 142 of the framework, paragraph 142, which is also interestingly on page 42 of the framework, the first paragraph under the heading protecting greenbelt land, that gives us some assistance, doesn't it, to understanding what's meant by sprawl, because it tells us that the government attaches greater importance to greenbelts. The fundamental aim of greenbelt policy is to prevent urban sprawl by keeping land permanently open. The essential characteristics of greenbelts are their openness and permanence.
Correct.
So it's the fundamental aim. What sits at the heart of greenbelt policy is preventing urban sprawl and keeping land open.
Permanently.
And that's why, of course, the courts have commented, unsurprisingly, that openness is the counterpart to urban sprawl.
Yes, that's the Smith judgment.
And when we think about why greenbelt policy was introduced in the first place, that's the fundamental point. It was to contain large urban areas, towns and cities, and prevent them spreading out and engulfing other settlements and becoming conurbations.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was. Success is a matter of judgment, but that was Abercrombie and his cohort's original intents in terms of greenbelt policy.
Yeah.
And also in terms of allowing access to the countryside for the occupants of those conurbations.
Yeah. So when we talk about unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas, we are concerned to prevent the expansion of urban areas. And I say urban areas in contrast to villages, for example, which are excluded from the definition by the PPG.
Well, villages are not considered to be large built-up areas.
Yeah. And they're in contrast to, they're not urban areas in the same way as towns and cities. There's a distinction.
I think one's got to be slightly careful because there are villages that one may consider have urban characteristics, but they're explicitly excluded from the definition, whatever the reason for that is.
Yeah. And urban characteristics is not the same as being an urban area, is it? One would typically refer to urban areas as towns and cities.
Yes, I think that's fair.
That's fair. And solar farms are not urban development, are they?
I think they have urbanizing effects, and they're more urban in character and type than they are rural and countryside development.
And that goes back to the point that we've just agreed in respect of villages, isn't it? That development may have urbanizing characteristics, but that doesn't make it urban.
Well, I consider in the context of the solar farm that will have a sprawling effect that's urban in character. So I consider it to be urban sprawl.
Can we turn, please, up to core document 8.2.1, which is the landscape statement of common ground?
Yeah.
So first of all, I want to get a really clear answer on this. Solar farms are not urban development, are they?
One has to define
It's
what
a yes or no question, Mr. Hughes.
I do need to predicate my answer.
No, you can clarify and
on this,
qualify, but I'd like you to
may.
answer the question.
Well, no, then.
No. They are not urban development. And when we turn up the statement of common ground, sorry, if you have a clarification.
No, move on.
Okay. Turn up the statement of common ground, please, to paragraph 4.5. What's agreed there is that the form of development of the solar farm would be quite different to that of housing and or airport development in its permanence, traffic movements, post-construction, character, appearance and materials. However, this doesn't preclude the potential for cumulative impacts. No concerns about visual or landscape cumulative impacts with other farms. So this is in the context of a cumulative assessment. But the point that I want to see if we can agree is that solar farms are functionally and characteristically different from typical urban development.
No, I wouldn't agree to that as a broad proposition, no.
Okay. Do you take issue? We've agreed they're not urban development. They are not characteristic of urban development.
Well, I think they have characteristics of urban development, and they certainly have more characteristics of urban development than they do countryside, rural, agricultural, leisure development. So, I mean, I refer to my earlier answer in terms of the characteristics of the form of development.
Functionally, they're energy infrastructure, aren't they?
They are.
Yeah, they're not places for people to live and work.
No, they're
No.
not.
So they are functionally different to typical urban development.
In that context, yes.
Okay. And what is agreed in the statement of common ground is that it is agreed the form of development of the solar farm would be quite different to that of housing, for my purpose here, in its permanence, traffic movement, character, appearance and materials. You don't depart from that as an overall
No,
judgment. No.
I mean, elements of airport development, one could argue it has certain synergy with, but I don't depart from that as a general proposition.
Well, I'm not. That's why I excluded airport development, because we're talking specifically about housing as being part of the urban development with which I'm concerned. But insofar as housing versus solar farm goes, and other employment, typical employment development, that is very characteristically different, or there is a characteristic difference between that and solar farms, isn't there?
Between housing and solar farms, yes.
Yeah. And between employment uses or employment buildings, places that people go to work.
Employment buildings,
Yeah.
yes, because they're not. There's only limited buildings on this site, but not employment uses necessarily. Open storage uses and such may have some similarities to this form of development. But yes, I agree in terms of employment buildings.
So I think where we get to after all of that is that solar farms are functionally and characteristically different from typical urban development.
And functionally different from typical rural development as well.
We've been through where solar farms occur in the country with Mr. Reynolds. We don't need to revisit that, but they are not unusual in the countryside, are they, Mr. Hughes, and becoming more common?
Yeah, I dispute whether they're unusual in the countryside. I think they are located in the countryside. Whether they're unusual in the countryside is a different question.
Sorry, forgive me. If we go back to the officer report, 3.1.1, hopefully you'll still have that open, but that point was recognised by the officer at 4.8.23 in her table 1, where she noted that it was in close proximity to Luton, but different character compared to the built-up development. So the officer noted that different characteristic as between solar farms and the existing built-up area of Luton. Yeah.
The different type and appearance of development.
Yeah, the word there is different character compared to the built-up development. Do you see that in table 1? Second column in respect of purpose 8.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
So the officer recognised that. And I want to go, please, now, if we may, to core document 5.1.4, which is the land adjacent to Harlow Road appeal decision. And that was a site we can see from paragraph 2 in Epping Forest District Council. And we can see from the main issues at paragraph 4. Do you have that, Mr. Hughes? Tell me if I'm
Yeah.
going too quickly. Paragraph 4, main issue was the impact on the green belt having regard to its openness and purpose. You see that from paragraph
I
4.
do.
And then the reasons from paragraph 5 set out what the inspector has to say about the reasons there. And if I can ask you to scroll down to paragraph 22. Well, actually, let's start at 21 because I think this probably has some bearing on later questions. 21, the inspector says, in making their arguments, the council placed much emphasis on the stage 2 Greenbelt review they conducted, but tellingly that document is silent on solar development. Subsequently, it has little bearing in the dispute before me, and we can agree that none of the Greenbelt assessment evidence base here deals specifically with solar either.
I don't think it does now.
No. And at paragraph 22, having regard to all arguments made towards framework paragraph 138, purpose A and B, so we're talking about predecessor framework to this one, but
Indeed.
the purposes are
Same
the same.
purposes.
Same purposes. I agree the solar farm would have a completely different character to existing built-up areas either side of it, also acknowledging it has substantial landscaping greenery as part of its overall composition. Goes on to say, in the absence of any shared characteristics to nearby built-up areas, the solar farm would be read and experienced in the local landscape as being entirely distinct from the urbanised and built-up qualities of Roydon or Harlow. Consequently, although the solar panels and associated development are no doubt engineered built features, recognition of that point does not suggest to me it would result in urban sprawl of an existing built-up area. Thus, I disagree that the scheme would contribute to sprawl from either Harlow or Roydon because distinctions in character would remain reinforced by natural landscaping, and then goes on to say that's consistent with another appeal decision. So the principal point there that the inspector was making was that solar development is incapable of constituting urban sprawl because it is characteristically and recognised as characteristically different from the existing built-up area.
That's what the inspector's saying, yes.
Yeah, and that's a conclusion that could apply equally here as a matter of judgment.
As a matter of judgment, it could, yes.
Yeah.
It's not judgment I agree with, you'll be unsurprised to hear, but yeah, yes.
Yeah. It's a reasonable judgment, isn't it, that the decision taker could arrive at?
I'm not going to criticise the inspector's judgment, no.
Yeah.
On the facts of that case, that's the judgment
Well,
he or she has come to.
you say that, you try and qualify it in that way, but what the inspector's saying there isn't about the facts of that case, is it? It's a principal point about the nature of solar farms as compared to the nature of built-up areas.
That's what that inspector considers, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now, on this question, we see your evidence, the way in which you answer this from paragraph 5.5 of your proof. And essentially, you follow two paths, if I can put it that way. First, you rely on the July 2016 Greenbelt Review and what that has to say about the parcel in which the site is located.
Well, I identify what it says as part of informing my overall
Yeah,
conclusions.
and then you go on to refer to the PPG. So I want to take those matters in turn. Now, the Greenbelt Review is core document 6.5.2. So if we can turn that up, please.
This is the 2016 review.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is no Greenbelt Review. If I can just assist with the chronology, there's no Greenbelt Review here that can be relied on that produces a PPG compliant grey belt assessment.
There's no Greenbelt review undertaken since the emergence of grey belts, so no.
Yeah. And the point of this document, that is called document 6.5.2, was to assist the council in identifying allocations in its emerging plan.
That's what it, well, I'm not sure chronologically that's correct.
Well, if we go down to page 9, section 2.
In the 2016 or 2018?
I'm in core document 652, which is the 2016, I think. Yeah,
Yes, it is,
July
yeah.
2016. So I'm not making it up, Mr. Hughes. I read this.
Oh, no.
Let's read section 2.1.1. North Hertfordshire District Council is preparing a new plan. The Greenbelt Review will inform the emerging local plan and provide background evidence to support the land allocations, guide policy formation, assist in discussions on development pressures with other authorities, identify any potential changes to the Greenbelt boundary and aid rationalisation of the Greenbelt area in North Hertfordshire. So the question I put to you was the point of this document was to assist North Hertfordshire in identifying allocations.
The only reason, and I'm not trying to be awkward at all, I think it assists in providing the evidence to support the land allocations rather than identify the land allocations. I think there's a subtle difference.
Tomato, Mr.
No,
Hughes?
not quite, because I think some of the allocations had been identified ahead of the outcome of the Greenbelt Review.
I
So
see.
I know it might seem like a pedant's point, but I think that's right.
Okay. In any event, it's evidence that the council used to support
Of course,
allocations.
Of course.
And those allocations were those found within the plan, none of which relate to renewable energy.
That's correct.
Yeah. And when we look down to 3, we're told that's paragraph 3 on page 9 of the document. Says this is an appropriate time to undertake a Greenbelt review in order to inform and manage in a positive way changes that are taking place. There are growing development pressures within the district.
Sorry to be paragraph. For some reason, my paragraph starts at 6.
You on? So I'm in section 2.
Yeah,
So
on
do
page
mine.
9.
So do mine. Mine starts 6, 7, 8.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's paragraph 8 we're referring to, isn't it? Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking at a different document to you. I hope it's the same thing.
It's North Herts Greenbelt Review, July 2016.
Yeah.
Section 2, 2.1 background to review.
Yeah.
And
It starts paragraph 6.
Well,
I don't know why it starts with paragraph 6, I've got to say, because there's no precursing. Oh, there is. Paragraphs 1 to 5 are on page 5. Background and approach to review.
that is very curious. Well, I'm on document. It's page 9 of the document itself,
Yeah.
which I think is probably the one where you've got your dodgy paragraph numbering.
Or you have.
Yeah.
Well, mine actually goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So
Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are on, but they're under section 1, but are on page 5.
right.
I think the inspectors is the same.
Yeah.
Gosh. Okay. Well.
I think the text is the same. But
Yes, what you've read out has been exactly the same.
Okay.
So,
Well, as long
yeah.
as the text is right, then that's probably okay. I'm going to read the paragraph. This is an appropriate time,
yes.
whichever paragraph number that is.
Yeah.
We're told this is an appropriate time to undertake a Greenbelt review in order to inform and manage in a positive way changes that are taking place. There are growing development pressures within the district. This, coupled with limited brownfield sites or sites within North Hertfordshire settlement boundaries available for development, means that areas within the Greenbelt are potentially needed to accommodate new housing and related development. And we know, of course, from the allocations that were made in the plan that Greenbelt was required. There were exceptional circumstances for the release of Greenbelt.
That's correct, and some of that was related to needs of North Hertfordshire, and some was related to the unmet needs of Luton.
Yeah, but when we look at East Luton, that's our most obvious example. For example, our most obvious example of a large site being taken out of the Greenbelt to meet housing needs.
Yeah, and that was taken out of the Greenbelt to meet predominantly the unmet needs of Luton, and of course, to do that, it has to be located close to Luton.
Yeah. And exceptional circumstances have to be demonstrated.
That's part of the plan process, yes.
Yeah. So this was about urban development. It was about housing development. It was about meeting primarily housing needs and how the Greenbelt could assist with that.
No, the document is assessing the land, but its purpose is to inform the plan, which is meeting the housing needs of and other needs of the district.
Yeah. The Greenbelt Review was to inform and manage in a positive way changes that are taking place. One of those changes, of course, was a housing need that had to be met by the
Through
emerging
the plan, yeah.
So this was concerned, we know, with needs arising for new housing development. Fundamentally, that's what it goes to.
Well, it's part of the suite of documents that informs the plan that is seeking to meet the needs of the district and the unmet needs of Luton.
Yeah.
And its purpose is to assess the Greenbelt in terms of such matters.
Yeah.
But it's assessing the Greenbelt, not the Greenbelt for housing. It's assessing the Greenbelt in the first instance.
So this goes back to your vacuum point, that this study was just looking at the Greenbelt generally without any regard to the nature of development that it was considering.
Well, it's considering the contributions of the land to the purposes of the Greenbelt, not the contributions of the land developed for housing to the purposes of the Greenbelt. It's considering the contribution of the land.
So do you say it's irrelevant that this study was taken out or was carried out in the context of assisting the council to identify where it might be best to put housing allocations?
No, it informed the overall decision. It's part of a suite that informed the decisions, but the assessment of the contributions of land to the purposes is an assessment that's made without regard to the form of development, because it's about the contribution of that land to the purposes.
Right. Okay. So
that contribution would be no different if it was a solar farm, a nuclear power station, a housing estate, or whatever. The land itself makes that contribution.
Okay, so that goes back to your point of approach, really, that you're saying that this study has equal applicability in respect of understanding the contribution made by the various parcels to Greenbelt, whether we're concerned with housing or solar energy development.
Absolutely, because what it's assessing is the contribution of the land to that purpose, not the contribution of that land with a housing estate on it to that purpose, or a nuclear power station, or a solar array. My view is that the outcome of the assessment in terms of the contribution would be the same, because it's about the land, whether the document was produced to assist with housing, employment, energy infrastructure, or whatever form of development, because it is assessing the contribution of the land. And that's clear when you look at the assessment criteria, because the assessment criteria doesn't include the contribution of the site if it was developed as a housing estate or an area of employment land.
Because there is nowhere, either in the evidence base, and that's unsurprising because the plan didn't seek to allocate land for renewable energy development. But there's nothing that we have here before the inquiry that assists or that assesses the Greenbelt and its capacity in North Hertfordshire for accommodating solar energy development.
No, I don't think there is a specific study. There's a criteria-based policy, of course, in the plan, but there isn't an allocation policy, and there's no land allocated for such uses.
Now, you said yesterday in your evidence that the site occupies 60 to 70%, I think, of the relevant parcel for this Greenbelt review, parcel 2F.
That's correct, yeah.
Can I understand, please, how you've calculated that, first in respect of the size of the parcel area, and then whether you've taken the red line as the site area or the proportion that will accommodate solar panels? What's your calculation?
The site, the red line site occupies.
Okay.
Because it's the red line site that we're assessing. It's the site that's for the purpose of the planning application that has to be assessed in terms of its contribution to the purpose.
Okay. And can I ask how you've calculated the size of the parcel? Have
Having
you done-
regard to it's there. I've necessarily included a range, 60 to 70, just based on a broad measurement of the parcel 2F and the area of the appeal site.
Okay. Are you able to provide those workings?
I haven't got them with me, I'm afraid.
You haven't got those workings. Okay. Well, I can ask Mr. Sharp what his view of that is and whether he agrees with you or not.
I mean, if we look at the just so you can appreciate what is being excluded. If we take the boundaries as the roads around,
Where are you looking? It might just help Mr. Hughes if we're all looking at the same thing.
I'm for the purpose of this, I'm looking at the figure 6.11, the zone of theoretical visibility and viewpoint locations, just because it's a wider plan that includes the wider area. And one can see, with reference to the extent of 2F, the land to the north of the appeal site that's excluded from the appeal site, but included in 2F. And then one has the areas that are excluded in terms of the inlays, if I put it in that way, to the south, around Wandon End House, and then around Darley Hall on the east of the site.
I'm not clear which plan you're looking at, I'm afraid.
Sorry, I'm not going to hold this up because I've got highlighting on it.
Right.
But
you said figure 6.1.1, but in what document? was
sorry,
that?
that's in the landscape evidence. It's the zone of theoretical visibility and viewpoint locations.
Whose landscape evidence?
It's from the original. Sorry, Mum, I've extracted it from a document, so I'm struggling to reference a specific document. Perhaps easier if we go to
location plan.
Theoretical visibility. That one. I've got that one.
I'm on a slightly different one, but it includes the whole area. So the area to the north of the site, between the site and the road, is excluded from the 2F, from the appeal site, but is included in parcel 2F. That's the largest element of
Right.
2F that's excluded from the application appeal site. I think broadly, I estimated the parcel to, and was assisted in doing this, in having an area of around about 180 hectares.
You considered 2F to be?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. The next place I want to go, please, is to Mr. Sharp's rebuttal, page 5, 3.2.
Can I put down the Greenbelt Review just for now?
Yes, I think you can actually.
Yeah, it's just I've got so many things open. Thank you. I'm there.
Yeah. And you'll have read what Mr. Sharp has to say about the Greenbelt Review and the reliance that can be placed on it in respect of this appeal proposal.
I've read it, yes.
Given, first of all, the chronological point, it was prepared before there was such a thing as grey belt, doesn't have regard to the PPG and the definition of grey belt set out in the National Planning Policy Framework, and it hasn't considered solely development.
Yes, and my point is that the contribution to a purpose is assessed in the Greenbelt assessments. It gives assistance to an overall judgment that could be made about the contribution of the appeal site to those purposes. Ultimately, that's a matter of planning judgment. It's a matter that I make my judgments on, Mr. Sharp makes different judgments on, and ultimately the inspector will come to her own judgment in respect of. But I think she will be assisted by that, because my view is that assessment of the contribution of the land does not have regard to the ultimate form of the development that's proposed. It's about the contribution of the land to that purpose.
I want to be really clear about this, because it's an important point for the inspector. Is it your case that the nature of the scheme that is proposed is an irrelevant consideration? And by irrelevant consideration, I mean one the inspector cannot take into account when considering if the site meets the definition of grey belt?
No, that's not what I said. I said in terms of assessing the contribution to the purpose
Yeah.
of the land, you do not have regard to the form of development. Whether the inspector decides it is relevant to have regard to the form of development, ultimately making her overarching decision on grey belt is a matter for her. But in terms of making a judgment on the contribution of the land to the purpose, I do consider the ultimate form of development is not relevant to that assessment.
Okay, I think you've said two different things in that answer, Mr. Hughes, and we need to assist the inspector here, because there's a decision to be made having regard to the definition. The question is this site one that contributes strongly to purpose A?
Yeah.
Okay. So what the proposition I'm putting to you is that the nature of the development proposed is relevant to that consideration. Is it your advice to this inspector and your evidence that the inspector is required to disregard as an irrelevant consideration the nature of the scheme proposed on this land when considering the contribution made to purpose A?
Yes, because it's about the contribution of the land, not the proposed development to purpose A. And I think that is clear in the definition in the glossary to the MPPF. Doesn't say the form of development, it says the land.
Let's turn up, please, core document 5.1.7, which is the charmingly named Butterfly Lane decision.
Just bear with me, please. Yes, I'm there.
Turn myself back on. This is dated April 2024, so it's not a post grey belt policy decision.
Quite.
But when we scroll down to the inspector's report, which is page 105 of 170, you'll see paragraph 410.
Yes.
And the inspector there is considering the Greenbelt assessment produced by the council as part of the work for the local plan.
Indeed.
And what that did was it identified parcels and provides an assessment of how they perform against the Greenbelt purposes set out in national policy.
Yep.
And at 411, the inspector said the appeal site is partly in parcel 9 and partly in parcel 19, which are assessed as having moderate greenbelt value and strong greenbelt value respectively. Inspector then went on to say, however, this is a planning appeal, not a local plan review. The appellant does not dispute the designation, and the ARUP report does not address solar farm development. Therefore, for the purposes of this appeal, I attach little weight to the ARUP report. I have considered the appeal proposals against the purposes of the Greenbelt, having regard to the specific nature of the proposal. Now, am I right, Mr. Hughes, that you would say, in respect of that, the nature of this scheme becomes relevant when assessing the proposals against purpose A after you've decided it remains in Greenbelt, but it's not relevant for the Grey Belt assessment?
That's correct. Yeah.
That's what you say. Okay.
And I think in terms of this particular part of the inspector's report, I'm having some familiarity with the ARUP assessment for that area as opposed to just council. It's not clear. I don't think the inspector's been clear on whether that they are comments about the purposes as opposed to Greenbelt contribution overall.
Oh, we don't have that work in front of us.
No,
but certainly.
No, but just reading what's said there.
What we can see is the point was what's found to be the case in an evidence base, which is assessing a larger parcel very often than the appeal scheme, and certainly not assessing the appeal scheme itself. When you have that situation arise, you can't simply translate the conclusions of one into the other.
Yeah, and I haven't done that. I've acknowledged the existing work that's been done and then discussed the site itself in terms of its contribution and come to my conclusion.
Okay. So let's turn up next, please, if we can, a document that wasn't advertised, but it's core document 5.1.19, and that's the Chapel Land Great Bar decision.
Yeah.
This was for a decision relating to a battery proposal in Walsall.
Indeed.
And this was post the MPPF 2024, so the inspector had to engage with the question of whether or not the site was Grey Belt land.
Yeah, the inquiry sat in November. The decisions the 13th of January, and the MPPF was published in December. The PPG postdates this.
Yeah. And when we go to the main issues, paragraph 17, we see, of course, Greenbelt is the issue there and the effect on openness.
Yeah.
And the inspector goes on to consider that from paragraph 18.
Yes, his reasons are set out there.
Yeah. And when we look down to purpose B merging, which starts at paragraph 25, do you see that?
Yes.
The inspector provides an assessment there where he says the proposal would result in physical development in the gap formed by parcel B93. Therefore, in the strict sense of this purpose, the proposal would not in itself lead to the merging of neighbourhood towns. However, the countryside and open land between towns is always under pressure from development. It's rarely the case that a single development on its own would cause neighbouring towns to merge. However, such areas could be lost incrementally and over time lead to the merging of neighbouring towns. Here, albeit temporarily, there would be a loss of greenbelt land between the towns of Walsall, Birmingham and Sutton Coldfield. This would result in a minor temporary reduction in the gap between these towns. Therefore, the proposal would contribute to the possibility of these towns merging. That said, significant open land would remain between the sites and these towns. There is very limited visibility of the site, and the BESS would have no material impact on the perception of the gap. In this context, and given the proposal would be temporary and would not lead directly to the merging of neighbouring towns, the site does not contribute strongly to purpose B. Do you see that?
I do.
That is an example of an inspector considering the specific nature of the proposal when answering the question of whether the site contributes to the purposes relevant to grey belt.
That's what that inspector has done, yes.
Yeah. And on your case before this inspector, the inspector there had regard to an irrelevant consideration in his decision taking.
Well, in my
Yes
view,
or no?
well, I'm not going to criticise the inspector for being irrelevant, but I am going to say that to meet the requirements of the PPG that postdates this decision, it's clear to me that the contribution is of the land and not of the form of development to the purpose. Otherwise, one would have to carry out a whole raft of greenbelt assessments to predict all forms of future development in assessing the contribution of that form of development as opposed to the contribution of the land to the purpose. And that goes, in my view, it goes back to the whole purpose of green belts and the fact that this is a spatial policy. Green belts is a spatial policy, and it's the land and the space that contributes towards the green belt, not future forms of development that we can't predict on land. It's how that land contributes to the purposes. And it seems even in government policy, in excluding, for instance, villages from purpose A, that's having regard to spatial elements of the land and not future forms of development, because how would the future form of development in any way impinge on the exclusion of villages from purpose A? That's about the size of the settlement and whether or not it contributes a large urban area or large area that is capable of sprawling. They're spatial judgments and not judgments about the form of development that may or may not come forward at any future period in time. And the land itself doesn't contribute any more or less to a purpose, whether or not future applications may or may not come forward on it for any particular form of development. The land makes the contribution, not the future proposals on that site.
Mm. You made the point that the Warsaw decision was in advance of the PPG.
It was.
But the PPG doesn't ask or doesn't answer the question we're asking, does it? Doesn't tell us in respect of carrying out an assessment of a site against the purposes of the green belt, whether or not one can have regard to the nature of the development on the site.
Well, I think it does. It doesn't explicitly say it in those terms, but what it does say under contribution, for instance, for purpose A is, and to make a strong contribution, assessment areas that contribute strongly are likely to be free of existing development. So assessment areas, not proposals, not future proposals, but it's the areas are likely to contribute strongly. And nowhere in there does it say, for instance, any well, let's be explicit, renewable energy development, if proposed on a parcel of land, will diminish the contribution of that land to the purpose. So I'm clear in my mind that the assessment is about the land and not about future forms of development. Otherwise, this PPG would be 1,000 pages long because it would have to deal with every potential form of development on in every scenario.
Does that follow, Mr. Hughes? So that's a matter of judgment for the assessors applying the broad guidance set out in the NPPF. I mean, it doesn't seek to give guidance on more common forms of development that might be subject to greenbelt assessment, like housing development and other urban development? Why would it need to be thousands of pages long to cover all different forms of development?
Well, if the point is that any form of development, a form of development influences the contribution of land and areas to the greenbelt purposes, I don't accept that that is a legitimate way of assessing the contribution of an area or land to the greenbelt. I accept that that is a future test that one applies in terms of the harm and the weight and the degree of harm, but I don't accept that is an assessment factor in the contribution of land to particular purposes. And I think that's supported by the PPG, that in terms there's assessment areas that contribute. It doesn't say assessment areas and the form of development that contribute.
The point you're making, it would be disproportionate for a greenbelt assessment to have to look at every different form of development that there might be in respect of different parcels that have been identified in the greenbelt. Is that the point you're making?
Well, no, what I'm saying is, the MPPF and PPG don't require that because to assess the contribution, you only need to look at the area. That's the point. You're looking at the contribution of the area to those purposes in terms of the grey belt assessment. You then, mindful of that contribution, can carry out your assessment of harm at the later stage. But that's not part of the grey belt assessment. That's part of the assessment of harm to the purpose.
Because when we look at paragraph 4 of the PPG, how should authorities define the land to be assessed? What is said there that is that in assessing their greenbelt, it will be, in most cases, necessary for authorities to divide their greenbelt into separate assessment areas for the purposes of identifying grey belt. The number and size of assessment areas can be defined at a local level and respond to local circumstances. Now, if a local authority is not proposing to allocate land for renewable energy for development, for example, then it wouldn't need to assess that sort of development, would it?
No, but it will have to assess the contribution of the land in the green belt to the purposes in order to define where there's grey belt. Grey belt isn't contingent on the form of development that comes forward. It's about the contribution of the land to the purposes, the area, the land.
I have your evidence on that. I'm going to ask Mr. Sharp about that when he gives his.
Right.
I want to focus on paragraph 5 and the guidance that we see in respect of the contribution made and how that's to be assessed. So we read this, that when making judgments as to whether land is grey belt, authorities should consider the contribution the assessment areas make to greenbelt purposes A, B, and D. Considerations for informing these judgments are set out below. And under purpose A, we read first of all, that's about sprawl of large built-up areas, and villages should not be considered as large built-up areas.
Quite.
And that, as we've agreed, is because villages are not regarded as large urban areas.
Large built-up areas, yeah.
Even though, well, that's the word used there, large built-up areas, but we've already gone through the process of talking about the fundamental purpose of Greenbelt is to prevent urban sprawl.
Yeah, but absolutely in strict terms, it's not a large built-up area. That's what it's considered. That's what it says in terms.
Yeah, they're not included within that. Some villages can be very large.
Of course, they can.
But they're excluded from that.
Yeah.
And then we're given illustrative features to assist in the judgment of the contribution made. There's no suggestion, is there, that this provides an exhaustive list?
No, they're illustrative.
We note that areas which are close to or adjacent to a large built-up area can fall in the strong or moderate category when it comes to the contribution made.
They can.
So that point isn't determinative of whether or not land is grey belt.
It isn't, no.
And areas that contribute or make a strong contribution are likely to be free of existing development.
Yes.
There is, as a matter of fact, development within the red line area of the site here because it includes the farm complex. And your evidence essentially is that that's a modest part of the overall site.
An extremely modest part, yes.
The site is currently separated from the large built-up area of Luton by roads, fields and intervening woodland.
Yes, the country lanes, the open fields and the wood blocks of small woodland that comprise part of the east of Luton area. That's of course not greenbelt, it's just land that now separates the two, that is the subject of obviously current applications and the allocation.
And in future, the development on its western edge, that which would be closest to the east of Luton, would contain a buffer around the panels and Stony Lane and Lower Road.
Yeah.
Yeah. We can see that on the enhanced mitigation strategy. It's probably a good plan to look at while we're having this conversation, just to keep in mind the nature and form of the site. But what we can see from that is that the site is contained by roads other than along the northern boundary.
Well, there are roads around the perimeter of the east, south and west boundaries of the site. I don't consider it to be contained by them, but there are roads there, the country lanes I would describe them as. There's also a road that bisects part of the site, doesn't contain it.
Yeah.
In that sense.
Okay, so you say not contained, but they're on the perimeter of the site.
Of three sides.
On three sides. Okay. And on the northern side, the northern boundary is where there is an abrupt change in topography and the land drops away down to Lily Bottom Road and into that different character area altogether, as we explored in the landscape evidence. Yeah?
Well, it drops down to Lily Road and then part of the valley, it rises back up, obviously, further north.
But there is a distinction where the northern red line boundary is. There is a topographical distinction between the site area and then what happens beyond.
There is a topographic distinction there, yeah.
Yeah, those are all matters, aren't they, which are relevant to considering the role of the site in preventing urban sprawl, and specifically whether there are physical features in and around the site that could restrict future development.
There are factors that can feed into that judgment. As I say, I don't consider they are matters that restrict or contain development, and that's evident in terms of lanes, for instance, by the appellant's own proposals as they were originally formulated and the extent of the appeal site that isn't constrained or retained by country lanes.
Well, let's do a compare and contrast in that respect, because as we've agreed, the local plan released Greenbelt for housing allocations here when it adopted the allocation east of Luton.
Yeah.
Considered exceptional circumstances had been demonstrated in respect of those allocations in order to alter the boundaries. And the east of Luton site, we can see actually in the appendices to your proof. I think that's probably the best place to go. So your appendix 1, you've got a series of plans.
Yeah.
And east of Luton is the purple on the plan.
Just bear with me. Yes.
And it's probably worth actually just turning, if you keep the MPPG out and you also have a look at the MPPF.
Just bear with me, it's somewhat on this table. Yeah.
Because what we're thinking about here is areas which might have physical features in reasonable proximity that could restrict and contain development. And that reflects, doesn't it, what we see at paragraph 149F of the framework, which is about defining greenbelt boundaries, having regard to using physical features that are readily recognisable and likely to be permanent.
That's yes, in terms of plan making, yes.
Yeah, so but they're similar concepts. It's about sort of restricting future development once you've defined a greenbelt boundary.
Well, it's about defining greenbelt boundaries that are clear and distinct. Yes.
Clear and distinct. Yeah. So in allocating the East of Luton and changing the greenbelt in that area,
Well,
the local
removing
authority
land from the green.
removing the land from the greenbelt, changing the boundary. The local authority would have been redefining those boundaries in accordance with what's now paragraph 149F, using physical features readily recognisable. And for the East of Luton allocation, which is 129 hectares allocated for approximately 2,100 homes, that relies on roads, including Stony Lane on its eastern border, doesn't it, as the boundary, as the new boundary to the Greenbelt?
I think Stony Lane is the only lane or road that defines any of the boundaries from memory.
Yeah, but that must have been regarded by the council as a defensible feature in releasing the East of Luton from the Greenbelt for development, yes?
It was, because that's the boundary they identified.
To the south of the East of Luton is obviously the built-up area of Luton, which it adjoins, but to the east and northern boundaries, it relies on woodland, topographical change into the Lily Valley, and field boundaries.
It does.
Yeah. And obviously the council and
And
the examining inspector regarded those as sufficiently defensible.
and woodland as well forms significant proportions of that northern boundary. But yes, they did.
Yeah. So we know, so far as that allocation was concerned, defensible boundaries were regarded as country lanes,
A country lane.
a country, forgive me, a country lane, woodland, and field boundaries.
They are components of those boundaries, yes.
Yeah. The same would apply in respect of the appeal site, yes?
No.
The next point I want to consider with you is the role a development which is not urban can play as a barrier to the expansion of large built-up areas. And for this, can we turn please to core document 5.1.31?
That's an appeal decision.
It's the Sam Smith
Oh, sorry, the judgment.
decision in the Supreme Court.
With me, please.
No more or less important, of course, than any appeal decision.
Oh, no. It was oddity of the filing system that we have judgments and appeal decisions mixed together at 5.1.
But it's the decision that we're all familiar with because it concerns the relevance of visual impact.
Yep.
As a component or
Yes,
a relevant concept in openness. But where I want to go, please, is to paragraph 22 within this judgment. If you tell me when you're there, it's on page 12 of 23.
I'm there.
And what's said there is that the concept of openness in paragraph 90 of the framework seems to me a good example of such a broad policy concept. It is naturally read as referring back to the underlying aim of Greenbelt policy, stated at the beginning of this section to prevent urban sprawl by keeping land permanently open. Openness is the counterpart of urban sprawl and is also linked to the purposes to be served by the Greenbelt. As PPG 2 made clear, it's not necessarily a statement about the visual qualities of the land, though in some cases this may be an aspect of the planning judgment involved in applying this broad policy concept. Nor does it imply freedom from any form of development. Paragraph 90 shows that some forms of development, including mineral extraction, may in principle be appropriate and compatible with the concept of openness. A large quarry may not be attractive while it lasts, but the minerals can only be extracted where they are found, and the impact is temporary and subject to restoration. Further, as a barrier to urban sprawl, a quarry may be regarded in Greenbelt policy terms as no less effective than a stretch of agricultural land. So what we see from that is that the court regarded a quarry in that case, in that context, as a barrier to urban sprawl. You see that?
I do.
And it could only be a barrier to urban sprawl if it were not urban sprawl itself.
Yes, and it, I think, may not always will be.
No.
Is what the judgment says. Yes, that's what the judgment says.
So, but that's may not be visually attractive. Is that the part that you're looking at? Is that the may not that you're referring to?
May be regarded in Greenbelt policy terms as no less effective.
Yeah. But what the court said further as a barrier to urban sprawl.
Yeah,
So the court drew a distinction. And it's right, as I say, it could only be a barrier. We may need to take a break. Caffeine is needed. It could only be a barrister if it were not the urban sprawl itself. That must be right. It follows. Did I again?
Sorry. Sorry.
But barrier.
Yeah, yes, but yes to the point.
It's a barrier. Good. Like the hypothetical quarry in that case, it's also right here, isn't it, that as a temporary development in the Greenbelt, which is to be decommissioned and the site returned to agricultural use, this development has the potential to prevent the urban sprawl of Luton into this area over its lifetime.
Well, over its lifetime, other urbanising forms of development wouldn't take place on this site.
That's not the question. Do you want me to put the question again?
Yes, please.
Yeah, we've agreed that solar farms are not urban development. My question to you is that, like the hypothetical quarry in Sam Smith, as a temporary development in the Greenbelt, which is to be decommissioned after 40 years and the site returned to agricultural use, this scheme can prevent the urban sprawl of Luton into the area. It can act as a barrier.
It can only act as a barrier to...
Yes or no?
Well, I'm answering it in the way I think is appropriate. It can only act as a barrier to other forms of development by developing this site with a form of development, in my view, is urban in character and has similar erosions in terms of the quality of the countryside, the spatial openness of the land that the Greenbelt is intending to contain. So I don't accept the overarching proposition that this would accord with the aims, the fundamental aims of Greenbelt policy, because I do think it has urbanising effects and presents a form, a commercial, industrial type form of development that, whilst not synergous with housing and employment land, urbanises countryside beyond its current appearance. So to that extent, I think it has spatial and visual erosions of the Greenbelt that, whilst they prevent it being developed for housing and employment land, have similar impacts on the functions of the Greenbelt.
You answered a lot of questions there, Mr. Hughes, none of which were mine. So let's try and go back to my question. The solar farm is not a form of urban development.
It's not a traditional form of urban development.
It can therefore act as a barrier to urban sprawl, specifically the urban sprawl of Luton, into the land area of the site over its lifetime. Agreed?
In that context, it can, yes.
Yeah. And I understand what you say about the specific effects of the scheme. You've made those clear, and we're going to come on to look at those in a bit more detail in due course. But of course, this is not permanent development. It is fully reversible in terms of its built infrastructure.
Well, it's a very considerable length of time, and it doesn't permanently retain the Greenbelt open. So you've got to, you don't turn the test around to say this isn't permanent development, you look at the purpose of the greenbelt is to keep it permanently open. It won't be permanently open. That's the conflict with the greenbelt. It's not turning the test the alternative way.
Well, you say it won't be permanently open. It will be occupied for 40 years and then will return to Greenbelt.
So it's not permanently open, yes.
The scheme isn't permanent. And we've just agreed
No,
it would
it's not about scheme. It's about the greenbelt being permanently open. And the greenbelt will not be permanently open.
If the scheme
Permanence and openness are the tests.
if the scheme is permitted, it would prevent permanent development taking place on this site for 40 years.
Only for the 40 years, yeah. But it will last multi-generational periods of time, a period of time that's multi-generational in terms of that erosion of openness and the impact of the development. So it's 40 years is a very considerable amount of time.
It's a very considerable amount of time for this scheme to produce renewable energy for as well, isn't it? 40 years worth of renewable energy.
That's factored into the benefits. The benefits are temporary in that sense, but they are for a considerable amount of time.
You've not said in your evidence that the site would be removed from the Greenbelt if it was developed. There's no suggestion that would be the case.
The appeal site?
Yeah.
No, I haven't.
No. The next point, I think, before we have a break is in the PPG about incongruous development. When we're looking at the contribution of a site made to
if developed,
to the
result in an
purpose.
incongruous pattern of development.
Yeah. So if developed would result in an incongruous pattern of development requires some assumption, does it not, about the nature of development that's to take place on the site identified?
It's the pattern of development, not the form of the development, it's the pattern of development.
The question, if developed, would result in an incongruous pattern of development requires at least some parameters, doesn't it, to be understood in respect of the way in which the site's proposed to be developed.
Yes, and that's what I think we've both done in terms of the assessments as to whether this development will result in an incongruous pattern of development.
Yeah, that requires one to understand the nature of the scheme, doesn't it? At least in some parameters.
This is about, this part of the test is about the scheme as opposed to the purposes.
Right. Okay. So in some respects, understanding the contribution of a site made to purpose A does require an understanding of the scheme. We're agreed on that.
Well, you have to understand the extent of the site to start with, and how its development, the pattern that will be created by its development, will relate to the Greenbelt.
Yeah.
So it's about, because we're agreed that it's about assessing the site, not a parcel, a subparcel, etc. It's the site. So we naturally arrive at the site through an application process. It's identifying a form of development, but it's the site that we're assessing still. So if developed, so if the site is developed, it will lead to an incongruous pattern of development. Again, we're not assessing the type of development, we're assessing the development of the site and the pattern that then ensues from that.
Okay, so just help me understand. You previously told the inspector that it's immaterial to this exercise of understanding the contribution land makes to purpose A for the Greenbelt definition to have regard to the nature or parameters of the scheme that are proposed. This part of the guidance makes it clear that one does have to have regard to the scheme that is proposed to be developed on the relevant piece of land that you're assessing.
No, it has regard to, if the area is developed, the area first, identify assessment areas. So if developed, not the development results in a incongruous form of development. If the area is developed, it will result in an incongruous pattern of development. If it was intended that it's the development, it would say the development results in an incongruous pattern of development. It says if developed, and the if is relating to the assessment area.
So incongruous pattern of development, you say, is a concept that can be understood entirely by reference to a red line.
Yes, I think it can be.
Right. Regardless of where the development is situated within that red line.
Well, you can have regard to that, but the assessment area is what you've got to identify in terms of carrying out the assessment. That's what the contribution and the approach of the PPG is, assessment areas.
It's really important we bottom this out because it has big consequences. You've just said you can have regard to that. And then you've said you've got to look at the red line. So let's be really clear. When looking at this, when looking at whether or not the assessment area, which is the site we're looking at in this case, would result in an incongruous pattern of development, a decision taker is required to have regard to the parameters and nature of the scheme proposed within that red line area. Agreed?
They can have regard, except they can have regard to that, but the assessment for a strong contribution has regard to the area itself and whether that area is developed and what the congruity or incongruity of that pattern of development, if the site were to be developed, would be.
I want to consider, because you say that that's what this scheme is, it's an incongruous finger-like development. I want to consider the harm that the policy is trying to avoid there. And my suggestion to you is that it's about preventing urban areas from spilling out into the greenbelt in a way that is uncharacteristic and incongruous with the existing settlement or the existing large built-up area.
Yeah,
Agreed?
congruous with the settlement, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I say incongruous to understand what that means. It's out of character, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But incongruous is the actual word used.
Yeah. But incongruous would be out of character with the existing large built-up area.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is where we come back to the character point, isn't it? Because a solar farm wouldn't be perceived as extending Luton out into the greenbelt.
Well, that's where we disagree.
That's where we disagree. Even if this was housing, for example, if we go back to your purple plan in your appendices, and we see the east of Luton site compared to the red line boundary of the proposal.
Yep.
With east of Luton as part of the baseline, this wouldn't be a finger of development anymore.
I think it'd be incongruous form of development with the east of Luton. That's why I've included east of Luton on that plan.
Okay, it's incongruous because it's a solar farm.
No,
and east of Luton is
the pattern of development.
Housing.
No, because the pattern of development will be create an incongruous pattern of development.
Because the pattern of development essentially follows the same approach as east of Luton in terms of being in the same character area, respecting the topography, i.e. going to the edge of the plateau, but stopping short of the fall away into the Lily Bottom Valley.
Well, I mean, I've included on those overlays the extent of development, the application site. My judgment is that that is an incongruous form of development relative to the large built-up area, and it's an incongruous pattern of development in the greenbelt.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think there's probably a good time to break, Mr. Hughes, and we'll come back and carry on to talk about paragraph 155.
Oh, wonder.
Thank you very much. So if we can come back at 25 past. Right, would you like to resume?
Is your microphone on, Mr. Hughes?
Hopefully, yes, thank you.
There we go. Super, thank you very much. I said we were going to move on to paragraph 155.
Yep,
One more question on the definition of grey belt, if I may, within the glossary of the framework. When one is considering if a site meets the definition of grey belt, that involves, of course, not only having regard to the contribution to purposes A, B, or D, but also to whether or not the application of policies relating to the area or assets in footnote 7 would provide a strong reason for refusing or restricting development.
yep,
The conclusion on whether or not a paragraph footnote 7 policy applies is proposal dependent, isn't it? Different proposals would have different impacts.
that's fair, yes.
Yeah, so in having regard to that definition and whether or not a site meets it, it is inherently necessary to have regard to the proposal that's being applied for.
In the context of footnote 7, yes.
In the context of the definition of grey belt land.
For that part of the definition, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go to paragraph 155 next then, please.
Yep,
And if the site is grey belt land, and I understand we don't agree, but what we do agree on is that all of those criteria at paragraph 155 would be met.
indeed.
And I want to focus on B for a moment and just spend some time on the need point, because there's very little difference between us on this. I think you accept that we're in a climate crisis.
Indeed,
You accept the need for this project and others like it is urgent.
indeed,
And it's an urgent priority for the country to ensure the significant increase in renewable energy generation to ensure national security, economic security, and in the words of the Secretary of State for net zero, energy security and net zero, it's an urgent priority for climate justice.
indeed. And I think all those matters are reflected in the statement of common ground.
Yeah, and what that is about, that last part, climate justice, I just want to spend a moment on that because it's ensuring that we avoid the impacts of climate change on people.
Indeed,
The scale of the challenge, again, no dispute between us, it's colossal.
quite.
And this government has affirmed its commitment to deliver renewable energy projects on a scale never seen before, much like its predecessor.
If it's much like its predecessor, it's similar to what's been seen before. But yeah, I take the point.
Yeah, well, what we have seen certainly over the last 5 years is a marked increase of the number of projects for renewable
absolutely.
energy coming forward and also gaining consent.
Absolutely accept that.
And the government wants to achieve that at pace because, of course, we have a legally binding commitment to reach net zero by 2050.
Quite.
And the government regards as a very important milestone on that pathway is the achievement of clean power by 2030.
Indeed.
And do you know what that means, clean power by 2030?
Well, it's the outlined in the document itself in terms of the milestones government are setting for the achievements over the period to 2050.
Yeah, but do you know what clean power 2030 means, what that's seeking to secure?
I'm not familiar with the absolute detail of the document. I'm familiar with the thrust of policy over the period and what it contributes towards that, and it's acknowledged in the statement of common ground as a component of that, of the overall renewable energy thrust.
Yeah, because that's a government flagship policy, isn't it?
Yes.
Clean power 2030.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand what it means in the context of this inquiry, which is a proposal for renewable energy generation.
And this will contribute towards those purposes, yes.
Those objectives, which is that Great Britain by 2030 will generate enough clean power to meet its total annual electricity demand.
Indeed.
And it's not just about meeting needs now. I think it's or should be uncontroversial between us that electricity demand is likely to at least double by 2050 as a result of electrification.
as a result of electrification and indeed other technological issues that are driving demand for electricity and removing oil and carbon forms of energy from the system.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be controversial between us, of course, that residential properties are only a proportion and a relatively small proportion of that of the overall energy demands. We agree that, yes?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And the information you provide at paragraph 3.15 of your proof, so 3.15 of your proof of evidence,
Yeah,
which is on page 18.
yes, paginated.
That's where you say the council has permitted 2 solar farms with energy generation of 99.8 megawatts within the last 14 months. Provide the figure of 37,000 homes, and you put that in the context of a district with coming close to 60,000 homes.
Yeah, the reason for that is that the appellant has predicated the output from the proposed development as 18,500 households being served. We inserted the clause it's the equivalent of, and I was contextualising that in terms of what the district has already permitted.
Yeah, I mean, it's given in terms of the homes provided because it's a readily accessible, understandable example.
And so is this, hopefully.
Yeah, but we have to understand that in the context that homes are only a proportion of the overall energy demand.
But
Yeah,
please, absolutely. I am not suggesting that what the council has permitted will meet the needs of the district.
yeah,
I'm contextualising the contribution that the appellant says the scheme will provide with what's already been permitted in the district
Right.
or exists in the district.
because and renewable energy schemes, we know they're not ring fenced for houses. The energy goes into the grid. It's distributed to all
Nationally.
enery demands nationally.
Yeah, I mean the input to any particular substation or link into the national network will not feed just into houses in that district necessarily.
Because and the reason that I go there to try and understand the point you're making, and I hear what you say in your oral evidence, but in the statement of common ground at 8.2, so
Just
statement that's
okay.
the overarching statement of common ground, core document 8.2.
Yep.
We have on page 17. This is our traffic light table.
I don't have a page 17.
Sorry, page 17 of the PDF. If you're looking at it in hard copy, it's page 4 of section 6, which is the colourful tables.
Yes, the numbering restarts, doesn't it, halfway through the document? Yes.
Yeah.
It's the page that has renewable energy storage, urgent local need down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's said there is urgent local need is not agreed. Is that
No,
right?
no, that the not agreed was added by Mr. Sharp. We put the qualification. We just wanted it to reflect what the council has already permitted in terms of its climate energy. We don't dispute that there's an energy emergency being climate emergency being identified by the council, and that the proposal would make a significant contribution. We don't dispute that. We added just the context for what has happened since the council declared that emergency. The appellant is not agreeing that's what's happened. That's what not agreed means.
So
It's not added by us.
You described that as a qualification. The addition you said
No,
was...
I didn't. It's a context.
You said qualification and then you said context.
Right.
Context, absolutely fine, but it's not a qualification because the fact that the local authority has granted permission for solar schemes or supported the grant of solar schemes that have then gone off to the Secretary of State, it's not a qualification of the urgency of the local need.
No, it isn't, and I apologise for that term. It's contextualising what the council has done, and the not agreed is the appellant adding that, not the council. We agreed it with that qualification. The appellant changed it to not agreed.
Yeah. And I think the reason for that is because the fact that the council has consented those schemes, I'll use that as shorthand for the fact
Yeah,
that
yeah.
consented or supported. The fact that the council has consented those schemes does not diminish the urgency of the local need.
And don't suggest it does.
No, it's irrelevant that the council has granted those schemes in considering whether or not local need is urgent now.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
as I say, we don't say here in local planning states the local need is not urgent. All we've done is contextualise our position. It's the appellant that's not agreeing that that's context.
In terms of that, Mr. Sharp has provided some figures in his proof of evidence at 315.
Just bear with me, please.
So
In his main proof.
his main proof of evidence, which is on page 9 of the hard copy document. I apologise to people reading it
Yeah, I'm there. Yes.
online. I apologise to the inspector. I'm not sure what the difference is between PDF and hard copy. +1. Okay. And what Mr. Sharp sets out there is the energy usage in North Herts in 2022 as being 451,000 megawatt hours.
Sorry, page 9. What paragraph did we say?
Forgive me. I'm getting the wrong reference.
I think we may.
Oh, it's page 16 under the heading local need.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm not
there.
sure where I got that reference from. Page 16. That sets out the
Indeed
usage in 2022 of 451,000 megawatt hours.
I don't dispute that at all.
Yeah. And at that time, approximately 50,000 megawatt hours was produced from renewable energy sources. So doing the straightforward maths, that leaves around 400,000 megawatt hours unaccounted for. And so what Mr. Sharp says there is even now that would mean that 6 to 8 projects of this size would be required to meet the energy demands just of North Herts.
If it was solar, yes.
Yeah. Of course, if it was solar. And as demand increases, as we expect it to double over the coming decades, that energy gap grows, doesn't it, to 600 to 800,000 megawatt hours.
I don't think it doubles, but yes, the estimates are it'll increase to that range, yes.
Yeah. And there's no sense, is there, then, having regard to that in which North Herts has yet done its bit to meeting even its own demand through renewable energy development?
Well, I mean, North Herts doing its bit. It can, in terms of the planning regime, it's permitted 2 schemes that have come before us. It's got a current amended scheme before it that it will determine, and it's refused this scheme. So in terms of applications that's become before the council, it's positively determined 2. It's negotiating on another scheme, and it's refused this.
Yeah.
So in terms of the development planning scheme regime, we're looking positively at schemes where we feel we can and supporting them. And indeed, in terms of the called in application, that was an application that the council was supporting and continued to support through the call-in process before the inspector and secretary of state.
Yeah, it's all very laudable. Quantitatively, looking at the figures we have between the gap of what the demand is and what the local authorities area is providing in respect of renewable sources, it's not yet doing its bit.
And neither's the industry in bringing forward adequate schemes. I mean, it's a 2-way process. It's not just the local authority in development management that can bring forward schemes. The industry's got to bring forward schemes for the development management process at the council to consider. So I accept we have not met the needs and there's not adequate provision yet, either nationally, regionally, or district-wide.
This applicant brought forward a scheme that the professional officers of the council and all technical consultees were content with,
They did.
didn't it?
They did.
What Clean Power 2030 means for solar is that the government wants to see about 2 schemes of the size of this appeal proposal consented every single week between now and 2030.
That's the outcome of it, yes.
That's the
Yeah.
outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah. So while we're sat here debating one scheme,
Yeah.
2 should be being implemented. That's the
Yeah.
reality.
Well,
I mean, the government-
implementation's different from
target.
permitted, of course.
But it's the delivery.
Yeah, it absolutely is the
Yeah.
delivery, yeah.
And to get delivery, you have to get consents.
Of course, permissions, yeah.
Yeah. And it also means a step change in the delivery of energy storage
Indeed.
if we're to have more renewables, because we can't increase our renewables capacity, which produces energy intermittently without the means by which to store it and deploy it when and where
Absolutely.
it's needed most.
Absolutely.
And it also means that all grid capacity where it exists needs to be utilised. Agreed?
Well, unless the environmental consequences of that are such that it leads to other harms, but yes.
Yeah. Well, let me put it this way. You appreciate that there are severe constraints on the national grid at the present time.
I do.
And without projects, first of all, utilising available grid capacity and bringing those forward, and without grid reforms, we cannot meet Clean Power 2030.
No, and investment in the national grid is urgently required to enable such matters. So yes,
Yeah.
yes, I accept that.
And meeting Clean Power 2030, that is decarbonising our energy system, is absolutely critical to reaching net zero by 2050.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So what that means as a starting point is a presumption that grid capacity, where it is available, should be used.
Subject to it not leading to adverse environmental consequences, yes.
Yeah. I mean, that
It doesn't mean the presumption is that you grant planning permission, no. We wouldn't be here if it did.
well, presumptions are rebuttable. As a starting point, one should look to utilise grid capacity where it's available.
I accept that's an important material consideration.
Yeah. And we agree that this is a scheme that can contribute to the 2030 clean power target if consent is granted.
Yes, if permission's granted, it will if it's implemented, yes.
And given the scale of solar that's expected to come forward, not just expected, but which is essential to come forward to meet 2030, it is a vast increase on the baseline level that we have at the moment. And we can agree, can't we, that solar farms are going to be or become more characteristic as part of the countryside around where we live.
I mean, until they exist, you can't judge the characteristic nature of the countryside. But there will always be areas where it won't be characteristic of the particular part of the countryside. They will become more frequent in the countryside. I think I can agree with that.
Yeah. Climate change is important, of course, for a number of reasons. Threat to the environment.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And also human health.
Indeed.
And biodiversity.
Yes.
And we see that if we turn up the Clean Power Action Plan, and that's core document 6.3.14.
Just bear with me, please.
It was on the list of documents I set out.
I'm there.
6.3.14. Clean
14. Sorry, I'm 13.
No, it's the action plan. 6.3.14.
Yep.
And it's page 41.
Page 41.
of 138.
Yes, I'm there.
Yeah. So page 41, that has the heading integrating clean power in the natural environment.
Sorry, my screen is just frozen. The link's just frozen. Sorry, I'm just going to have to reload it. Yep, sorry.
You've got that.
Yeah.
So you should see the heading integrating clean power in the natural
Yes, I have,
environment.
yeah.
Yeah. And what that says is the world is facing twin climate and nature crises, which threaten our global health, wealth, and security. These are inextricably linked. Not only is the UK government committed to reaching net zero by 2050 and clean power by 2030, it is also committed to restoring nature, as demonstrated, for example, with the Environment Act targets in England to halt decline in species abundance by 2030 and effectively protect marine protected areas as part of our global 30 by 30 commitment. The UK is one of the most depleted countries in the world, most nature depleted countries in the world. So it's not enough for us to protect and conserve the nature we still have left. This is why the government has committed to restoring nature through such targets and our related international commitments. And it goes on to say climate change is itself one of the greatest threats to nature.
Indeed.
So we understand, don't we, that if we don't begin on the path to reaching net zero, the consequences for human health and nature are potentially catastrophic.
Absolutely, and that's reflected, I think, in the weighting both parties give overall to such matters.
Because those are, we agree, real world consequences, real world harm, tangible harm of failing to tackle climate change.
Absolutely.
And delivering renewable energy is absolutely critical to avoiding those consequences.
It is.
And it's in that context that we assess your evidence yesterday, because what you explained to the inspector was that if the site is grey belt, if it can be regarded as grey belt, then notwithstanding the landscape and the heritage harm, you advise permission should be granted.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we know from that approach, from your answer, that it's the site's planning policy designation as green belt, which is your biggest objection, because if that green belt objection falls away and the site becomes grey belt, you accept that the benefits of the scheme outweigh the landscape and heritage harm.
The combined weight of greenbelt, landscape and heritage outweigh the benefits. If the benefits are diminished by removing the greenbelt, if the harms are diminished by removing the greenbelt harm, then the benefits outweigh the residual harm.
Yeah. So it's this site's designation, planning policy designation as green belt, which is your biggest objection. Because if that falls away, the scheme gets consent.
Well, no, it's the without the green belt harm in the balance, then overall the benefits outweigh any residual harms. I think it is the biggest, almost weighty of the harms, but I don't accept. It's the way you balance all the benefits and all the harms that lead to the conclusion, not individually picking one or two out.
Well, I'm approaching this the way you approached your answers yesterday. If all we are left with is landscape and heritage harm, then your advice would be to the inspector that planning permission should be granted.
Absolutely.
Okay. So that means that the critical factor for your planning balance then is green belt.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just dealing with that, how does the harm to the green belt, a spatial planning policy designation, manifest here as a real world tangible harm?
The diminishment of openness in both the spatial and visual sense, the harm to the purposes through sprawl of the large built-up area and the encroachment into valuable countryside.
Okay. How does that manifest as a harm to the natural environment?
It's to the appreciation of the countryside and the distinctions between town and country, and the enjoyment of the countryside, and the appreciation of the difference between urban and rural areas.
Okay, let's go back to my question. How does that manifest as harm to the natural environment? Not people, not people's appreciation of it, not their enjoyment of it. How does it manifest as a harm to the natural environment?
Well, the natural environment is developed. I mean, that's not the test for the purposes of planning. The test is whether it leads to a reduction in openness and permanence, and the tests that emanate from that in terms of openness and the purposes of the greenbelt. That's how the planning system in greenbelt works. And in those terms, the development will substantially erode the openness of the countryside, both spatially and visually. And that would also lead to conflicts with the purposes that we've rehearsed already. So in terms of planning policy and the role of the countryside and greenbelt in that, it would erode that.
Okay, that's not my question. We all know what the tests are because we've all read the National Planning Policy Framework and we've been through it in your evidence. What I'm asking you is how those effects that you identify manifest as a harm to the natural environment.
I'm sorry, I just don't understand the premise of the question in terms of, in greenbelt terms, what that means.
Yeah, well, the greenbelt effect, or the greenbelt, the designation of this site as greenbelt, means that if you develop it, there is a harm to openness.
Yeah.
There's a harm to encroachment, and there is a dispute between us on the harm to purpose A, which is about urban sprawl. But how does that manifest as a tangible harm to the natural environment, to biodiversity, for example?
Well, it doesn't, because we're in agreement that there's a benefit to biodiversity.
And in terms of that harm,
and that's not a greenbelt consideration.
No, because it's not.
It's a standalone issue.
It's a planning policy spatial tool, essentially. Greenbelt policy.
Well, greenbelt is primarily a spatial tool. Yeah.
And those impacts that you identify, the harm to the greenbelt from harm to openness, encroachment, and so on, how do you say that manifests as a harm to people?
Well, in terms, I mean, you've heard from members of the community as to how they interpret it as potentially impacting on them. But in terms of access to the countryside and appreciation of countryside and openness, I think it has adverse impacts. It erodes the openness of the countryside. It encroaches with a significant area of development into what is currently open countryside. So I think it does have. So
you've spoken there about, can I put it broadly this way, visual amenity and amenity of the countryside surrounding? Well,
they're elements of it, but the tests in greenbelt policy and the purposes of greenbelt policy are spatial.
Yeah, humour me. I understand that they're spatial because I've read the policy, but humour me with my questions, if you will, please. Those visual considerations, perception of the countryside, etc., those are all taken into account in the landscape, particularly the visual impact assessment that's been discussed as part of the evidence by Mr. Reynolds and Mr. Morris.
Well, there are also elements of the test for openness, as Samuel Smith tells us, in terms of
can be.
But I mean, I'm more than happy if we're saying we don't consider any elements of visual harm here, and it's purely spatial, because in both contexts I consider there to be substantial erosions of openness.
Yeah. And what I'm seeking to understand is how that manifests as a tangible, real world harm for people over and above the effects that have already been identified as part of the landscape and visual evidence by
Well,
Mr. Reynolds.
I think just pure appreciation of countryside and being able to access the countryside on your doorstep are important considerations. And I think that will be substantially eroded by the proposed development.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. And I'm going to suggest that all of those matters are taken into account in the landscape and visual evidence that Mr. Reynolds has presented and that you've adopted. Those are features that you mention as part of the landscape and visual impacts of the scheme in finding a conflict with as you do with the development plan on that basis.
And I also refer to a number of them in my assessment of openness.
Yeah. But the point is that if this is not greenbelt, we agree, or if we take the greenbelt question out of it, we agree that the benefits of the scheme are such that they outweigh the landscape and visual harm, don't we? And we remind ourselves, of course, that the scheme was originally promoted on the basis that it was in the greenbelt and needed to demonstrate very special circumstances to exist. And it was recommended for approval on the basis that it was greenbelt and that very special circumstances were demonstrated.
That was the judgment of the case officer, yes.
Yeah. We know that solar farms can only be sited where there is a viable connection to available grid capacity.
Yep.
Every project starts with that connection. It's critical to development of solar schemes, isn't it?
I think every project now starts with that consideration, yes.
Yeah. And sometimes the only way that capacity in the grid can be utilised is by siting a scheme in the greenbelt, yes?
It sometimes can be, yes. And those considerations have to be weighed in the balance in terms of greenbelt applications.
But we have a unified policy approach across both the NPSs and EN1 in respect of renewable energy and greenbelt that could be regarded as providing a positive presumption in favour of this scheme. Do you agree?
No.
You don't?
Well, I mean, your scheme is specifically designed to avoid the DPS, the NPS regime.
Do you mean the NPS regime?
Sorry, what did I say? Sorry.
DPS.
DPS, sorry, the NPS regime.
Sorry, it's not the worst linguistical faux pas we've had today.
No.
I think I take the award.
We're 1-1 now. It's specifically designed to be out with that regime. So in that context, we look at the MPPF, the PPG, and then we're mindful of the EN1 and EN3 and their policies, looking at where they add or fill voids in the MPPF and PPG, or add to our understanding of those policies, because the primary policy basis from government for considering this application is the MPPF and the PPG.
Well, and your development plan.
And sorry, I'm talking about government policy in the context of the EN1 and EN3.
Yeah. Okay, let's take this in stages. The MPS is a material consideration in the determination of this scheme. We agree that.
Yeah.
And let's see if it can provide us with some assistance upon how we might approach this. And I want to go first of all, please, to core document 6.2.2, which is EN1.
Yep.
And within that, if you can turn, please, to section 4.2, begins on page 52.
I'm there, yeah.
You're there.
Sorry.
And you're familiar with the concept of critical national priority infrastructure?
Yeah.
Yeah. And what that tells us from 4.2.1 is that the government has committed to fully decarbonising the power system by 2035. Well, that objective we know has been brought forward. It's been updated to 2030, subject to security of supply to underpin its 2050 net zero ambitions. More than half the final energy demand in 2050 could be met by electricity, as transport and heating in particular shift from fossil fuel to electrical technology. Ensuring the UK is more energy independent, resilient and secure requires a smooth transition to abundant low carbon energy. The UK's strategy to increase the supply of low carbon energy is dependent on deployment of renewables and nuclear power generation alongside hydrogen and carbon capture storage. Our energy security and net zero ambitions will only be delivered if we can enable the development of new low carbon sources of energy at speed and scale. And what we then go on to read at 4.2.4 is that as a result of those policy ambitions and the recognised need to act at speed and scale, the government has therefore concluded there is a critical national priority for the provision of nationally significant low carbon infrastructure. Yeah?
Yeah.
And the way it has chosen to do that is through the policy. It then goes on to set out within this section on critical national priority infrastructure and the way that should be considered by decision takers. And we can see how that operates when we go down to 4.2.15 on page 55.
Yeah, and I think just looking at 4.2.5, that none of that's intended to extend the definition of what counts as nationally put infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Hughes, you understand I haven't put my questions to you on the basis that this scheme comprises nationally significant infrastructure and one to which this policy framework applies by default. That's not the proposal, is it? Because of course this scheme falls just under the threshold of the 50 megawatts. And there's no criticism on the applicant for bringing forward the scheme in that way, is there?
No. And it's a common practice that many applicants do that.
And what we see here is a national policy statement that is written in light of that threshold of 50 megawatts. First of all, saying that it can be a material consideration. Yeah, and we know that decision takers have had regard to it as a material consideration. But the reason that I'm putting these questions to you is because what we see in critical national priority infrastructure as a policy concept is a radical shift to enable the consenting of a much greater scale of renewables in sensitive areas where previously that may not have been acceptable. Do you agree?
That's what it says, yes.
Yeah, because what we find at 4.2.15 is that the starting point for critical national priority infrastructure in decision taking, forgive me, that's 4.2.15 and 16. The starting point will be that infrastructure has met any of the tests which are set out in the MPSs or any other planning policy which requires a clear outweighing of harm, exceptionality or very special circumstances. Yeah. And we're told that in all but the most exceptional circumstances, consent will be granted for critical national priority infrastructure. And that includes, if we look to 4.2.17, not just greenbelt. So there's a presumption as the starting point, and of course it's rebuttable, but the starting point is that development of critical national priority infrastructure within the greenbelt should be allowed. That's what 4.2.17 says. You see that?
Well, yes, I accept the broad proposition.
Yeah. And it's not just greenbelt, is it? Because we can see on the list at 4.2.17, for example, where there's substantial harm to a heritage asset, which should be exceptional or wholly exceptional, the presumption remains that critical national priority infrastructure should be granted consent. You see that? The final bullet point.
The starting point is that it will meet that non-exhaustive list, yes.
Yeah. And of course, in respect of that test, that can include the demolition of a Grade 1 listed building.
It could.
Yeah. And this policy would assume as a starting point that consent should still be granted.
Yeah, I've not seen any of those decisions yet, but yes.
But what we know from that is it is a radical policy shift, isn't it? To provide a presumption that even where a scheme gives rise to such harmful impacts, there should still be a presumption that consent would be granted in all but the most exceptional circumstances.
In the circumstances of such schemes, but that is not a presumption that's carried through in the later policy document, the MPPF, which retains energy infrastructure of this scale as inappropriate development, where the presumption is in the alternative.
Yeah, but if this scheme were just a little larger,
But it's not.
no, I appreciate that.
And it's consciously not at your client's behest. It's not the council that has put this development below the threshold. It's your proposal that makes it there. And the correct policy and the more up-to-date policy is the MPPF, and that doesn't follow that line.
Help me with this, Mr. Hughes. The closer the size of a scheme is to the NSIP threshold, the more relevant this policy is.
Well, no, it's just not. I mean, it's the relevant policy is the MPPF, because anything below 50 is considered in the context of the MPPF. It's anything above 50 and above that is considered in the context of this policy. So the correct and more up-to-date policy is the MPPF, and indeed the threshold is going to increase, as I understand matters, to 100 in the emerging document. So we will be further away from what is now considered to be the threshold between the two. So I accept we're very close to the threshold, but we're outside the threshold, and we're designed to be outside the threshold being considered.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. Let's take this stage by stage. We agree this is a material consideration.
It can be material consideration,
Yeah. So the inspector has to consider what weight to put on it, because that's what one has to do with material considerations. You've got to identify it, then understand whether or not it supports the scheme or otherwise, and then decide what weight to put on it. So it's a material consideration. It supports the scheme, yes?
Yeah.
And in terms of weight, the closer a scheme is to the threshold, the greater the weight that can be given to the support set out in MPS.
It's capable of having regard to the more up-to-date policies contained in the MPPF that are directly relevant to the scheme. I think it's only where it's adding or filling voids where weight can be can be any more than low levels of weight in support in conflict with other relevant policy documents.
So you say this support scheme, material consideration, but only low level of weight. Is that your evidence?
In the context of the green, where we were talking about the green belt, and it being the presumption being that it's not inappropriate in effect, then I'd say it carries no weight, because the MPPF, which is a more up-to-date policy, clearly considers it to be inappropriate development. So I don't think the starting point in terms of that more up-to-date policy document is anyway affected by EM1.
Sorry, can I just have a really clear answer to the question? Mr. Hughes, it's really important we understand your approach to it. We agree it's a material consideration. We agree it's a material consideration in support of the scheme. What is the weight you say that the inspector can attribute to this policy if the site is regarded as being in the green belt?
Very little.
Very little.
Because I think the policy, the relevant policy, and there is relevant and more up-to-date policy, and that is the MPPF that has been formulated post this document, mindful of this document, mindful of what the presumptions are in this document, and its presumption is in the alternative in terms of green belt. And indeed, the in terms of the proximity of this development to the threshold, the direction of travel is that that threshold will move quite significantly further away from this scheme.
But the policy as it's written at the moment was written for the circumstances that I think we'll find ourselves in for the until the outcome and conclusion of this appeal, which is that 50 megawatts is the threshold.
Yeah, I accept that.
Yeah. Okay, and indeed the MPPF itself, doesn't it, sets out that regard can be had to the MPSs.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, so it works both ways. One can cross-refer across both documents. The MPPF isn't seeking to replicate the detailed policy set out within the MPSs. Is
No,
it?
but what I would not accept is that if the MPPF intended the starting point with this form of development to be a presumption in favour, it would say that in clear terms. That would be, because there's a manifest conflict if that's the position of the appellant between the two policy documents.
You're putting suggestions to yourself that I haven't actually made.
No, I'm explaining why I consider the MPPF to be the most up-to-date document and the most relevant document, indeed the relevant document in terms of Greenbelt policy for this scheme.
The policy intention behind this approach of critical national priority infrastructure was concerned to ensure that renewable energy schemes were consented even where they gave rise to serious harms.
Yes, for those schemes. Yeah.
It was a policy to enable those schemes to come forward at scale and pace.
Yeah, that was the intention behind it, yes.
Yeah. And what it tells us is that the government recognises that renewable energy schemes will have to be delivered at times in sensitive areas if we are to meet our climate change targets and binding commitments.
I think that's fair, yeah.
Yeah. And on your very limited weight point, I just want to posit an alternative view. And it's called document 5.1.2.
Just bear with me, please. I've got so many things open.
So 5.1.2 is land to the south of Marsh Farm following
Yes, I have it.
decision of Inspector Woolcock. The proposed development is set out from paragraph 11 and the main issues from paragraph 15, which include as the final issue 3 Greenbelt. And that's where the inspector starts his reasoning from paragraph 16. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
And if we scroll down to paragraph 39, this is where the inspector is engaging with NPS EM1 and the issue of critical national priority infrastructure. Well, forgive me, sorry, this is a different point. We'll go on to the critical national priority infrastructure in a moment. But what he says at 39 is for NSIPs, EN1 notes that virtually all nationally significant energy infrastructure projects will have adverse effects on the landscape, and that all energy infrastructure is likely to have visual effects for many receptors. Given that the capacity of the appeal scheme falls just below the NSIP threshold, I believe EM1 is a material consideration and that its underlying aims for energy development should be given more weight in this case than conflicts with policies CSTP 23 and PMD2. You see that?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
So if you look up, you'll see that the policies 37 or paragraphs 37 and 38, they set out what those policies say. But what we can see the inspector doing here is giving more weight to the national planning statement and national policy statement than the development plan of the local authority in which the scheme was situated.
Well, those specific policies on character and design, I think, aren't they? They're not the Greenbelt policies as far as I understand. In the circumstances of that case, I mean, there's no dispute between the parties that the energy, I put it in a very broad terms, the energy benefits of this scheme are substantial benefits. The scheme, I don't in any way seek to diminish or undermine that. Ultimately, the final balance that the inspector will come to will weigh the benefits and the harms and agree or disagree on the nature of harms, the weight to be given to harms, and indeed the weight and nature of benefits. I don't think there's any suggestion from us that she should deal with the benefits of renewable energy in anything other than being a substantial benefit of the scheme. And I please, if I've given any indication that's the case, that is not my evidence.
Let's scroll down, please, to 66, because the point you made was that those were landscape and visual policies. I don't have them in front of me, but let's assume it's a good point. Paragraph 66, we see the inspector returning to the issue of EN1. You tell me when you're there.
Yes, sorry.
Policy CSTP 26 provides encouragement for opportunities to generate energy from non-fossil fuel and low-carbon sources, but adds that a proposal would be unacceptable where it produces a significant adverse impact that cannot be mitigated. The harm I have identified to the green belt from inappropriate development cannot be mitigated. This brings the proposal into some conflict with Policy CSTP 26. The appeal scheme would not constitute critical national priority NSIP development for the purposes of applying EN1. However, EN1 provides that the Secretary of State will take as a starting point for decision-making that such infrastructure is to be treated as if it has met any very special circumstances test. Given that the capacity of the appeal scheme falls just below the NSIP threshold, I believe that EN1 is a material consideration and that its underlying aims for energy development should be given more weight in this case than any conflict with policy CSTP 26. Do you see that?
I do, yeah.
So the inspector there, again, giving more weight to that national policy intention, albeit applying in a different regime than the council's or than to the conflict with the council's development plan policy insofar as it relates to Greenbelt. You see that?
He does in that section from 2024 that predates the latest iteration of the MPPF. And I accept that's what he does, yes. Having identified inappropriate development as, I think, the only element of the harm pursuant to the policy as I read that paragraph.
With that policy, but I mean, the inspector will read the whole thing. There was landscape and visual too.
No, sorry, just in the context of that paragraph that we read in that policy, yeah.
Okay, then let's go and have a look at the MPPF, shall we, and what that has to say in terms of its guidance. And it's paragraph 160 that I'd like to go to.
Yep. I'm there.
Which is in the Greenbelt section on page 47. And what that says is when located in the Greenbelt, elements of many renewable energy projects will comprise inappropriate development. In such cases, developers will need to demonstrate VSC if projects are to proceed. Such VSC may include the wider environmental benefits associated with the increased production of energy from renewable sources. There is no other policy in the framework, is there, that seeks to identify the circumstances in which very special circumstances might arise?
Sorry, can you just repeat the question? Sorry.
There is no other policy in the framework that seeks to identify the circumstances in which very special circumstances might arise.
No, it's relatively, well, it is rare to find any prescriptive key to what are very special circumstances. I think there's a number of appeal decisions and judgments that identify very special circumstances by their very nature and not a prescriptive list of factors.
And here is an example of the National Planning Policy Framework, a pithy document supposed to reduce thousands of pages.
Yeah, when you add it to the
planning policy, singling out renewable energy projects for special treatment.
Well, it's identifying clearly that renewable energy projects will comprise inappropriate elements of many renewable energy projects will comprise inappropriate development, then rehearses the test that's applicable to all inappropriate development, then gives an example of one of the factors that may assist in contributing towards very
Yeah.
special circumstances. Yeah.
There's many laudable developments out there, hospitals, schools,
Yeah.
all of those. They're not singled out within national policy with wording that explains that there are circumstances in which the benefits alone of the nature of that scheme might give rise to very special circumstances. That's not found anywhere else in national policy, is it?
No, and I
So-
mean, it is what it is.
So the question is why? Why does the national planning policy framework single out renewable energy development for this special treatment?
Well, oh, sorry.
My question, or rather the proposition I'd like to put to you, is that it is designed to make it easier for such projects to demonstrate very special circumstances.
No, I'm not sure I'd agree with the proposition that it's designed to make it easier. I think it's designed to assist in ensuring that decision makers have regard to a particular benefit in assessing that form of development. And I think it's possibly, and I'm speculating here, specific about renewable energy projects being inappropriate development, to be clear about the distinction between EM1 and the MPPF in terms of the thresholds.
Well, sorry, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever, Mr. Hughes, because what's appropriate and inappropriate in principle is set out much earlier in the framework, isn't it?
Well, what's
Under paragraph 153, that's where we find the categories of development which are defined as not inappropriate in the Greenbelt.
154? Sorry.
So, well, it's under proposals affecting the Greenbelt, and then we see 153, and then the categories of development set out from 154.
They're the exceptions.
Yeah.
Yeah. And renewable energy isn't one of those exceptions.
Yeah.
But EN1 reverses a presumption, I suspect, and I'm only postulating this, that maybe 160 was inserted just to be clear. But I accept it identifies that very special circumstances may include, so part of the overall package of that comprises very special, but can include the wider environmental benefits. And indeed, both parties acknowledge that in their evidence.
So I can be clear on your evidence. Within this document of refined national planning policy, the government took the trouble to introduce an entirely new policy into the Greenbelt chapter to make clear to everyone that renewable energy projects would in most circumstances be an appropriate development in the Greenbelt. That's the reason you say introduce paragraph 160.
Well, no, I said it clarifies and it makes clear that they are inappropriate development, and then sets out that they can only be permitted in very special circumstances, and such circumstances may include the environmental benefits. And I accept that. So it does both things.
Chronologically, this policy was introduced, because this isn't the first iteration
No.
of the MPPF that it appears in. Chronologically, it was introduced before the concept of critical national priority infrastructure.
I can't recall when it was inserted into the MPPF, which of the numerous versions we've had over the last few years.
Well, if I'm wrong about that, then you can come back and tell me. But
Yeah.
that's the chronology as I understand it. This policy is not designed to make it harder for renewable energy schemes in the Greenbelt
I'm
to get a consent.
not suggesting that at all.
Yeah. And the policy is not put in to do nothing. It's not put in just for the interest of the reader, is it? It's designed to do something. So if it's designed to do something, what is it designed to do? My proposition is it's there to flag to the decision taker that a consideration, an important consideration in Greenbelt renewable energy schemes is going to be the wider environmental benefits associated with the increased production of energy from renewable sources.
There's no difference
Yeah.
between us on that.
And that factor alone, notwithstanding any other benefits that might accrue from the scheme, that factor alone may be sufficient to amount to VSC.
It could well be, yes.
Yeah.
And always the case in all Greenbelt cases that one matter is capable of clearly outweighing the harms and therefore comprising VSC. And it may be a basket of considerations, it may be a single consideration, but that's not unique to any development. But I accept all that as a proposition, but I also repeat that it also clarifies and makes clear that renewable energy projects are inappropriate development, or elements may comprise.
Well, no one's saying that they're appropriate by definition, are they?
Well, they're not, but so why does it say it then? To follow the logic through, why would it say it if it didn't need to? Presuming that policy is meaningful and isn't intended to be repetitive, then one would assume it's saying it for a purpose.
The appellant in this case provided an alternative site assessment in support of the scheme.
Did.
That's not something that the council or you have taken issue with.
No, I don't take any issue with it.
And what that demonstrates is that there are no sites available which would be preferable in order to utilise this grid connection.
That there's no difference between us on that.
Yeah, so you accept that this is the best site available to utilise the capacity at the Luton Airport primary substation.
Yes.
And if this scheme doesn't come forward, there is no other scheme, is there, that can be built to utilise the available capacity and contribute to Clean Power 2030?
There's no other scheme before us that my view would be there's no preferable scheme that could come forward.
Yeah.
That.
And you have no evidence, do you, to disagree or dispute Mr. Sharp's point that there are no preferential alternative sites outside of the North Hertfordshire Greenbelt which would be both suitable and available to come forward?
I'm not offering any evidence in that regard.
And that's an important material consideration in this scheme, isn't it?
It is, yes.
And it weighs in favour of the scheme.
It does.
The fact that the scheme is time limited is also an important material consideration and relevant to Greenbelt considerations, isn't it?
It's a consideration. I don't think it's relevant to Greenbelt considerations. I'm not sure how that.
Because we're agreed that the site would remain Greenbelt throughout the lifetime of this scheme.
Well, you can build anywhere and it remains Greenbelt. Building on Greenbelt doesn't change its designation until the plan changes the designation.
Yeah, but there's no suggestion that if you put a solar farm here, in some review of the plan later on, it will be taken out of the Greenbelt by reason of having a solar farm on it.
But I haven't offered that evidence, no.
No. If you built a large housing scheme, then it might be that upon review of a plan, given that's a permanent development, it would be taken out of the Greenbelt, or the boundaries would be altered to accommodate that housing development.
I think it normally happens the other way around, as is the case in east of Luton.
Yeah.
That the allocation removes the land from the Greenbelt in the first instance.
Yeah, but it can happen either way around. I agree that
it can, but not on that scale normally.
Yeah, I agree that forward planning is the more likely scenario. Let's just have a look at the EN3, please, if we can now. So that's the renewables specific national policy statement, and it's 6.2.3. 6.2.3. And within that, if we can turn, please, to page 106. Actually, 106. And it's paragraph 210.49. So 2.10.49. It's probably quicker to do a search for that.
I'm there, thank you.
Oh,
Sorry, I
Not the
think
right
that may
reference.
have been the inspector, not me. Sorry.
It'd be great if I was there too. It's
Oh.
210 149. Forgive me.
210 140.
149.
Yeah.
It's on page 106. And this is within the section concerning solar farms. And it's under the heading technical considerations, and then the subheading project lifetime and decommissioning. You see that?
Sorry, just bear with- Solar voltaic generation is 210,
Yeah.
and this is under the immediate titled Secretary of State decision making.
So we're at 210 149. It's internal page 106 if you have that.
Yeah, and that's Secretary of State decision making.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
But we're under the technical consideration.
Oh, yes,
heading.
pursuant to that, yes,
Yeah,
yes, I accept.
Okay, so 210 149 says an upper limit of 40 years is typical.
Yeah.
Although applicants may seek consent without a time period or for differing time periods for operation, the time limited nature of the solar farm where a time limit is sought as a condition of consent is likely to be an important consideration for the Secretary of State. Do you see that?
I do.
And it says the Secretary of State should consider the period of time the applicant is seeking to operate the generating station, as well as the extent to which the site will return to its original state when assessing impacts such as landscape and visual effects, and potential effects on the settings of heritage assets and nationally designated landscapes. Do you see that as well?
I do.
So in the knowledge that most schemes are for a period of 40 years, or 40 years is typical, what this tells us is that that's likely to be an important consideration for the decision taker. You see that?
Yes, that's what it says at 210 150.
Yeah. And you accept, do you, Mr. Hughes, that a time-limited scheme should be regarded as less harmful than one which is permanent?
Yes, I accept that, and I've included consideration of that in my assessment of harm.
Yeah. Okay, well, we've traversed far and wide around these topics, and I want to bring it back to Greenbelt considerations now.
Can I put aside EN3 now, or just I've got quite a lot of
Possibly, but not too far away.
Yeah.
So, but back to Greenbelt, and two impacts I want to focus on if the site is regarded as remaining at Greenbelt and not Greybelt. The first is openness.
Yeah.
And the second is encroachment. And we agree, don't we, that they're the main considerations for Greenbelt assessment in this case?
Well, in terms of purposes, the main purposes that are conflicted are A and C.
Yeah.
And openness is obviously in both dimensions. But
the
yeah,
overarching.
yeah.
Yeah. But we forgive me, we've sort of done A. So I'm going to focus on.
Absolutely. We residually only got C.
We could go back, Mr. Hughes,
No,
if
please
you like.
don't.
I mean,
I don't think anybody would thank us for that.
let's talk about urban sprawl some more. Okay, for openness and encroachment, many of the same factors apply to consideration of this scheme as against those concepts, don't they? So the impact on the openness and the impact in respect of encroachment, there's an overlap with the considerations that apply to both.
There is a degree of overlap.
Yes. And the inspector's well familiar with the nature of solar development, having considered schemes in the Greenbelt. I don't need to labour that in front of you. But a few points, what we know is that solar development is less harmful in respect of openness than a great deal of built development, given its light footprint, airspace under and between panels, and its relatively low-lying height.
It can have lesser impact, yes, I accept.
And that observation can be tested by considering what the impact of other built development would be on the same site area, for example, B8 sheds or even a conventional power station.
Yeah, but I think we haven't got an alternative. We're not considering this against an alternative or a fallback. We're considering this against the baseline, which is what's there at the moment. So I accept that it may not have as harmful an impact as some other theoretical form of development, but that's not before us.
No, appreciate that, Mr. Hughes. But when one is deciding the weight to be given to an impact, you consider the baseline, you consider the scheme before you and what its impacts are, but you understand those impacts by reference essentially to the world around us, to what the impact of other development might be, to how the spatial and visual qualities of openness can be affected, and whether or not this scheme engenders the same impacts.
Well, you weight it, applying judgment in terms of, most importantly, the baseline, and then the impacts of this development on that baseline.
Yeah, but there's a judgment to be reached, isn't there, as to what the overall impact is, and that involves looking at the nature of this scheme, and how it will sit essentially within the landscape framework that's proposed.
That'll be an element of it, yes.
Because on the spectrum of potential impacts, solar development is more sympathetic to openness than other forms of built or urban development.
It can be, but that presumes other forms of development will come forward in such locations. As I say, I'm not sure that is a consideration because there is no fallback in this case. It's an assessment of this scheme on this site in regard to the circumstances of this scheme. But I accept that, by way of example, an Amazon warehouse on this site is capable of having a greater impact on the visual aspect of openness.
Grassland would remain in and around the panels, and the field patterns are respected and enhanced by this proposal, aren't they?
They are.
And the site area occupied by the panels is less than half of the overall site area, 45 hectares of the 106.
Yeah, the site area of the development is 45 hectares, yes.
Yeah, and that represents, I think Mr. Sharp gives a figure of 0.3% of the overall green belt in North Hertfordshire.
Yeah, and that's only relevant to considering whether the strategic aims of 155 are conflicted by the development. This is about a consideration of the impact of this development in this part of the green belt. We've gone beyond the grey belt consideration.
Well, it doesn't become an irrelevant consideration because it can be relevant in this respect, can't it? That for the use of 0.3% of the overall green belt in North Hertfordshire, what you're getting is a 49.9 megawatt solar farm and battery storage facility.
Well, yes, but every single form of development could posit that that approach, and we'd have death by 1,000 cuts if that was the approach to be taken to harm to the green belt. I don't accept that's the appropriate approach. I accept that the inspector may well take that into consideration in their overall weighting.
Well, that would be if those other schemes had to be in the green belt. We know that this one does, and you accept that there's no preferable alternative outside of the green belt to utilise the capacity
From
the
this
grid
connection.
that this does. This is a scheme which we know is broken up by green corridors, a wealth of new planting and areas for enhanced biodiversity and recreation, yes?
I'm not going to intrude on landscape evidence. There are, well, the footpaths are retained through the site. There's nothing new there. There's hedge planting and planting around the site. I accept that.
Yeah. And it's agreed between us in the statement of common ground. Visual is a different point, but from a landscape character perspective, the site will contribute positively.
I'm not giving landscape evidence, but just take me to the
that's CD 8.2.1.
Yeah.
That's the landscape statement of common ground.
Yeah.
And it's 4.12 within that.
That's following decommissioning.
Yeah. The retention of the field boundary hedgerows delivered by the project would result in permanent beneficial effects on the landscape character of the site and its
So
immediate
once the
pun-
development's gone, there will be the retention of the field boundary hedgerow would have positive.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, but I don't think that's how the question was framed.
In terms of the visual envelope of the site, we can see what that is, and I've dealt with Mr. Reynolds about that. But we agreed, and I think you were here for his evidence yesterday, that the visual effects are localized to the red line boundary of the site.
I didn't understand that to be the position. I thought they were wider, incorporating the viewpoints beyond the site. My apologies if I've got that wrong, but that was my understanding of the evidence.
Well, the inspector will have a note on that.
Absolutely.
We don't need to go there. What you do take the same point as Mr. Reynolds about in your evidence is about planting affecting the openness of the greenbelt.
Where do I do that? Sorry.
So it's within your proof of evidence. If you go to page 36, you've got the heading impact on openness. Do you see
Yeah.
that? And when you go to 5.65, that's where you're describing what Mr. Reynolds has to say.
Yeah.
And then at 5.66, you say the experience of passing through the open countryside with an sorry, this is halfway down. The experience of passing through the open countryside with an appreciation of the wider open arable landscape will be replaced by a tunnel between fields of solar panels and other infrastructure rising to 3.5 metres above ground level. The proposed hedgerow planting will only serve to further reduce the existing appreciation of the open, wide, undulating landscape and to create a corridor experience.
Yeah.
And then you say at 5.71 in conclusion on this section, in passing the site, the experience will change from one of an open arable landscape, which forms part of the larger undulating open rural landscape, to one dominated by substantial expanses of 3-metre tall solar panels and structures. Proposed mitigation in the form of hedgerow planting will only serve to further reduce appreciation of the wider landscape, resulting in a tunnelled effect. The loss of openness will be experienced from around the appeal site and will be substantial.
Yeah.
You see that?
I do.
Okay. You acknowledge, don't you, that planting is not development and by definition cannot constitute harm to the greenbelt or its openness.
Of itself, no, it can't.
It's incapable of being inappropriate in the greenbelt.
Of itself, yes, because it's not development, as you say.
So this might be an adverse visual effect on the council's case, but it's not a greenbelt effect, is it?
Well, it's.
Yes or no?
I don't think it's as easy as a yes or no, unfortunately. If this was a scheme of hedgerow planting, it would have no impact on openness because it's not development. It's consequential on development. Its purpose is to screen development. It of itself reduces the existing experience of openness on passing through the site. The existing experience of passing through the site is one of open vistas on the footpath network. They will be enclosed by development, and that development is hidden by the landscaping. So the existing experience of openness will not exist because of development on the site, but the hedgerows themselves do not diminish openness.
So hedgerows do not diminish openness. We
Of themselves.
we agree that they are not to be regarded as harmful to greenbelt openness.
Well, they're not development, so they can't diminish
They can't
openness
be.
in that sense.
Yeah.
Mindful again that it's a spatial policy.
What you've identified is a visual impact or an impact on visual amenity.
But it's on the visual aspect of openness, experiential.
Yeah, it's what you're identifying is the change to people's view.
No, it's the change and the experience of openness. That's what the visual aspect of openness is. It's about the experience of openness as opposed to the spatial contribution towards openness. And at the moment, one experiences passing through the site, through the footpath network, wide open views across open arable fields. That will be reduced by the development, and the development is hidden behind hedgerows.
Openness is a spatial concept that exists whether or not you can see it.
Absolutely, and that the old PPG was very clear on that.
Much like significance to heritage assets, it doesn't depend upon people being able to see it.
But it's an aspect of openness, as the courts tell us.
It can be.
It can be, and it is in these circumstances of this site. It is experienced out with and within the appeal site.
Greenbelt is not a policy which is designed to protect visual amenity, is it?
No, it is.
It doesn't depend on public access.
Well, no, but there is public access to this site, and there is a full appreciation of the openness of this part of the Greenbelt by passing around and through this site. And that will diminish as a result of this development.
We know that the court has found, and we can go there if you like, visual quality is not in itself an essential part of the openness for which the Greenbelt is protected.
I haven't suggested visual quality is any part of my Greenbelt case. What I've said is that the openness of the Greenbelt is appreciated in this area, and the loss of openness will be experienced in this area, and that is material to an assessment of openness, as it's one of the two aspects identified.
And what we see, in fact, within the MPPF, in respect of Greenbelt, is examples of where planting, for example, tree planting, forest planting, is regarded as a good thing in the Greenbelt. Yes.
Sorry, I'm not.
Well, let's go to the MPPF. Let's have
Yeah.
a look at paragraph 152.
Yeah, sorry, it's home there.
Yeah, you've got that. Just when my computer's decided to freeze. Let's put it this way. There is nowhere within national planning policy or guidance that planting is regarded as a bad thing in the Greenbelt.
I'm not for 1 minute suggesting it is.
What we see
mean,
is the opposite conclusion.
Sorry, I mean, moreover, given the MPPF is dealing with development and it's not development,
Yeah.
it'd be surprising if it ever did comment that way. I don't for 1 minute suggest that planting is harmful of itself to the Greenbelt. I've never suggested that.
Yeah. Because where you arrive at with this is you say visual impact or visual effect is relevant to the openness of the Greenbelt, yeah?
The visual aspect of openness is relevant, yes.
Yeah. And what you say is that the scheme will be harmful upon openness. That will have a visual aspect. After the scheme is decommissioned and the solar panels are gone, the hedgerows are not capable, and tree planting are not capable of giving rise to a harmful impact on openness, are they?
No, they're not. No.
No. Okay. So that effect that you're talking about only exists while the scheme is in place.
The harms to the greenbelt only exist during the lifetime of the development.
Yeah.
I've not suggested they persist beyond the lifetime of the development.
Okay. You and I have a challenge to get through the next few questions in the next 10 minutes, Mr. Hughes. And we're going to start with the development plan, and we're just going to have a trot through the policies which are relevant to the determination of the scheme. And the development plan is called document 4.1.
Yes, I'm there.
And the first policy that we're going to have a look at briefly is policy SP5.
Yep,
And that's the policy that concerns countryside and greenbelt.
it is indeed.
It's the policy that is recorded in the first reason for refusal.
It is.
It is a policy which is pretty pithily stated and out of kilter with national policy on greenbelt. Because although it refers to it, it doesn't, for example, make reference to paragraph 160 and what that has to say about renewable schemes in the greenbelt.
Well, it was found to be consistent with government policy when adopted,
Yeah.
which tells us that paragraph was inserted after, probably inserted after the
Yeah.
adoption of the plan. So
To be clear, I don't make a particular point
No,
about
no.
that. Where we get to is that the scheme has to be assessed against national greenbelt policy.
I don't disagree at all.
And if this scheme accords with national greenbelt policy, we can take SB5 to be satisfied.
I absolutely accept that. If we're MPPF Greenbelt compliant, it would satisfy the requirements of the policy on Greenbelt. And likewise, the cross-reference in SP5 is to the natural environment section of the MPPF, and the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside is, and it calls it intrinsic value, but I think we can align those two paragraphs with that aim.
Can we go to policy NE2, please, which is landscape?
Yeah.
So we're on to second reason for refusal now.
Yeah.
Page 152 of the PDF. And it's positively worded. Planning permission will be granted for development that satisfies the following criteria. Now, the first, A, respect the sensitivities of the relevant landscape character area and have regard to the guidelines identified for built development and landscape management. That's about landscape character.
It is.
And respect in that context can be about siting, layout and mitigation incorporated as part of the scheme.
It can be, and it can be about the effects of the scheme on character as well.
And the inspector will need to consider the relevant character guidelines that we've looked at in the landscape evidence.
Yeah, and she'll consider the evidence of both those witnesses in coming to her own judgment.
Yeah, and of course the landscape statement of common ground.
Of course.
And in respect of B, that does incorporate questions about visual impact as well as character.
Yeah.
And it says, don't cause unacceptable harm, taking account of the mitigation. So the threshold that we see there is unacceptable. This is not a policy which requires all harm to be avoided.
That's fair, yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think inevitably, there's a certain inevitability that development will cause some degree of harm, and you couldn't have a threshold that says no harm shall be caused.
Yeah. And it's not a policy generally, NE2, that requires any particular outcome in that respect. It's not a do no harm or protect policy. These are things to have regard to as part of your scheme. And if the inspector considers that the scheme responds to the landscape context and has regard to the guidelines of the landscape character assessment in the mitigation scheme, then that policy could be complied with, providing there's no unacceptable landscape and visual harm.
Yeah, that absolutely. If she doesn't consider that in that context any unacceptable harm to character and appearance occurs, then she could find the scheme to be policy compliant.
Then we've got policy NE12, which is the renewable and low carbon policy,
Yep,
which is on page 168.
yep,
And that has two categories of development in the first paragraph: proposals for solar farms involving the best and most versatile agricultural land. That's this scheme. It does.
Yeah.
But that's not an issue between us. It's a factor to which you attribute neutral weight in the planning balance. And then the second category is proposals for other renewables and low carbon energy development, which would contribute towards reducing greenhouse gases, will be permitted when.
Mhm.
So there is a certainly a presumption, a rebuttable one, in this policy in favour of the grant of consent. Yeah.
yep.
It doesn't require a particular outcome, by which again I mean it doesn't require a no harm scenario.
No, and I'll be very clear that I am not suggesting that if there is any minutiae degree of harm, that the development plan would support the refusal of planning permission. That's not my case.
Yeah. Well, we've already seen in respect of landscape that anything short of unacceptable could potentially comply with policy NE2,
That's
couldn't
what I
it?
just agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not about minute harms. There could be some big harms, and the scheme would still be acceptable.
Along the spectrum.
Yeah. Okay. And what we see there as well within that policy is an instruction to the local authority to take the contribution of such schemes to meeting climate change objectives pretty seriously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it requires, consistent with the climate emergency that they've declared, regard to be had to such factors. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. In respect of the benefits, I'm not going to go through each one because you've given evidence on where you land with the benefits, and Mr. Sharp's going to give his in due course. And there are inspectors who find different things,
Of course.
and we could draw out some examples, but this inspector will arrive at her own conclusions.
Indeed.
So let's understand a few points of approach. The greater the need, or the stronger the policy imperative is for something, the more weight that can be given to it if provided for by the scheme.
Yes, and I think a common ground between us, we both put the imperative in terms of renewable energy at the very top of our
Yeah.
scales.
Where there are different components of a scheme which address different needs and requirements, they may be given separate weighting.
They could be given. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I said may, not must.
Yeah.
And obviously, I'm getting at the solar farm and the battery as separate elements here, because batteries and solar farms come forward as separate projects, don't they?
They
Come
can
forward
come forward as separate projects, yes, and they increasingly come forward as integrated projects to manage the output from sites.
Is that your understanding? What's your evidence for that they increasingly come forward as integrated projects?
Well, I mean, we've seen an increasing in time, so it's more common now to find battery storage incorporated on solar sites.
Is it?
Than it, well, certainly in my experience, yes. If I'm wrong about that, I don't think it matters, but that's my overall observation.
Co-location of battery energy storage and solar farms is encouraged but not required. That's correct, isn't it? And they serve different but complementary roles. Do you agree?
Well, the complementary, yes, yeah.
Yeah. And different. One is producing renewable energy, one is storing
so
it.
it can be released, yes, at the times of need.
So they're different roles, aren't they?
Well, all part of the of generating renewable energy that is usable and helps to decarbonise, rather than just generating energy that perhaps is wasted. But yes.
Yeah, because
yes.
BESS don't generate energy, do they? They store it.
No, they don't.
And not necessarily just from solar farms either.
No, battery storage is used for other forms of development.
There is as great a need for battery energy storage systems as there is for other renewable low carbon projects.
Yes, as part of the renewable energy, creating usable renewable energy, yes.
And to provide support to grid services to help in balancing the grid as we move
Yeah,
away from conventional power energy generation.
Yeah, because that's part of creating a usable source of renewable energy that will meet needs as they arise.
The biodiversity benefits that will arise from this scheme have to be viewed in the context that this council has declared an ecological emergency. Yeah.
Indeed.
And that this country is one of the worst performing countries actually in the world for biodiversity loss.
Indeed.
And so much so, as we read in the Clean Power Action Plan, that the government has mandated a requirement, modest as it is, for biodiversity net gain.
Indeed.
And what we have here, the capability of this site to meet biodiversity net gain, to deliver it, is way beyond any requirement in law or
It's
policy.
well beyond the threshold, yeah.
And we can agree, can't we, in biodiversity terms, that the appeal site will be better off if this scheme gets a permission than if it doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. For the period of the lifetime of the development, yes, absolutely.
There are benefits which you haven't considered in your planning balance. One of those is landscape enhancements.
Yes, because for the reasons Mr. Reynolds set out, we consider it to be a neutral factor in the balance.
Well, you say that, but the statement of common ground refers to, after decommissioning, that there would be positive character benefits.
Yes, but I think it was balanced against the visual impacts in Mr. Reynolds' evidence in terms of arriving at a neutral factor.
Okay, we don't need to go back over the landscape evidence because the inspector's heard that.
Absolutely.
But you will understand, as the planning witness, having regard to all of these factors, there is a difference between landscape character and and visual impacts.
I do, but
Yeah.
the benefit is weighed overall, and we've come to a neutral weighting in terms of it being a factor in the planning balance.
We haven't come to it as a neutral factor in the planning
So
balance. Could you weigh it as a harm on the visual side? You've got a harm arising from the planting obscuring views in the long term.
Yeah, so it's neutral overall.
No, because you've included the harm. So if you're going to include the harm on the visual side, you need to include the benefit on the character side.
I've only included the harm over the lifetime of the development. You're talking about the effects beyond development.
Yeah.
Beyond development, it's a neutral factor. I'm
Okay.
not saying that once you take the solar panels away from this site, that there will be harm to landscape character. That's not what we're saying.
Okay, or visual on your planning balance.
Well, on visual, I think there is some impact from Mr. Reynolds identified the tunnelling will persist if the hedgerows are retained.
And that's exactly the point that I've just put to you. We've gone full circle, Mr. Hughes.
So overall, there's landscape character benefits and there is the tunnelling, and they weigh together in terms of the character and appearance issue as a neutral factor persisting beyond the life of the development.
And the point that I'm putting to you is that you've weighed that harm, that visual harm in your planning balance beyond the lifetime of the scheme because you accept what Mr. Reynolds has to say about it. But then into the other side of your planning balance, you've not put the character benefits.
I haven't weighed it in my Greenbelt balance beyond the life of the development. I've only weighed it for the period of the development. The beyond the development impacts are neutral.
Okay,
because I'm considering both.
Forgive me, you've just introduced the term greenbelt into your answer. We're talking about the planning
Greenbelt,
balance as a whole.
Sorry, I did not mean Greenbelt if I said Greenbelt. It's been a long morning and afternoon.
Nearly done. Final issue is about the permissive footpath and the recreational opportunities that will be provided in the site. New recreational opportunities at field 13.
Yeah.
Field 4 and field 18 and 19 and the footpath.
Sorry. Field
for- sorry,
18 and 19 are
Yeah, so field 13 will be available for use by members of the public for
Yeah.
recreational, and a new footpath
oh, sorry. I thought, yeah.
in fields 18 and 19 that will take users off the road and allow a link with the footpath on the western side
Yeah.
of Stony Lane. So those are benefits of this scheme in terms of provision of open space and recreation, and also safety in respect of that new footpath that will take users off the road that you haven't weighed in your planning balance.
I haven't, because I don't consider them to be secured benefits.
What do you mean secured benefits?
Well, my understanding of the conditions is that they don't secure the provision of field 13 as open space. It's a wildflower meadow, as I understand matters, that contributes to BNG. It's not secured for public access in the conditions that I was aware of. I mean, we can come on to it in the condition section, but that's certainly my instruction.
Which is the one that no, but that doesn't say it's the biodiversity, isn't it? Yeah, you've seen the approved plans as part of condition 2.
Yes,
Yeah.
the planning layout 04, yeah.
No, it's which one of those sets out? Well, first of all, the footpath is set out within the enhanced mitigation strategy that's going to be an approved plan. Yeah.
Yeah, and the planning layout includes the footpath, so I accept that.
Yeah. And also included within that is another plan which sets out the recreational use of field 13. It's the biodiversity and landscaping plan. Have you seen that? I'm just getting it now. I think it's 2.2.17. Or 2.3.4. There you go. Nowhere near. 2.3.4. Ah, that's the most up to date one. Yeah. Yeah. 2.3.4. You tell me when you have that, Mr. Hughes.
Yes, I've got that.
Yeah. And do you see the notes attached to field 13?
Yeah, large open area of native wildflower, grassland and mixed scrub creation to form an area of permissive parkland for community use. Trees, shrubs and medium height growth planting will also be added to improve biodiversity and provide additional screening benefit.
Yeah. And the footpath over on field 18 is shown there as well, which extends over, well, no, well, wherever field 18 and 19 occurred, that's where the footpath is. We know the location of it to provide that wider link. So those are secured. Does that change your answer then, Mr. Hughes, that these are a benefit of the scheme?
I think the footpath is, I can accept there are benefits from the footpath. I still don't accept that the field 13 is secured in any way for public access. And I don't believe it's assessed in the biodiversity net gain scheme as an area of public access. But I'm happy to be told to the contrary. But I certainly don't think it is secured by condition for public access.
Well, this plans to be secured by condition, Mr. Hughes.
I've got to say, I don't believe that's strong enough to conclude that this is an area of public access. And one has to assess that against the background of this is a site that is crossed by numerous public rights of way. So it has public access through it as a recreational resource. And I don't think that there's any, well, even if it is secured, I think it is of negligible weight in the planning balance. Negligible positive weight, I hasten to add.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hughes.
Thank you.
Those are my questions.
I've just got a quick point of clarification.
Absolutely.
And I just wanted to check the position regarding the potential extension to the Chilterns National Landscape.
Yeah.
I think I read that it's no longer going ahead. I just wanted to check if I got that right or not.
That's my understanding. Mr. Reynolds, I think, may have appended to his proof the response of the Chilterns board to that decision. I think government have, I'm not sure what the correct terminology is, but abandoned any proposals to extend, certainly in this area. I think possibly as a matter of factual update, if over the lunchtime I just get the correct terminology.
Yeah, sorry, I may have addressed it to the wrong person.
No, but over the lunch break, I will get the correct terminology for you rather than me batting around trying to.
Right, yeah, thank you. Miss Daly, do you want to do your re-examination?
Yeah,
Before we
and
break for lunch, unless you've got hours to.
No, I don't. I certainly do not have hours. I appreciate this isn't a specific point of re-examination, but if I could ask Mr. Hughes a question about the Chilterns National Landscape, I think we can resolve your question. So if hello there, Mr. Hughes, firstly.
Good afternoon.
If I could ask you to go to CD 12.1, which is Mr. Reynolds' main landscape proof of evidence. And PDF page 29.
Why am I going there when I've got a hard copy? Yes.
And we can see there that there's a heading that says Chilterns National Landscape, and this is the part of Mr. Reynolds' proof where he deals with that. And then if you go down to 4.2.46, bearing in mind the question the inspector's just asked you,
Yes.
Is that the part of Mr. Reynolds' proof of evidence that you had in mind when the question was posed?
It is, and yes, Ma'am, you'll see there, Natural England announced the cancellation of the boundary extension review. And the review was considering whether to incorporate this site into the Chiltern landscape. Yes. I couldn't remember where it was.
Okay, we'll move on now to properly speaking questions of re-examination. Yes. If I can ask you, cast your mind back to much earlier this morning, and you were asked a number of questions about the Council's 2016/2018 Greenbelt review.
Yeah.
And you were asked about effectively the purpose of that review. Now, can I ask you to turn up? It's CD 6.5.1 is the review, or the first part of the review. Sorry, thank you.
Right, so just bear with me. I've opened it. Yes, I'm there, sorry.
And if you go to PDF page 5 of 160.
What number's that paginated?
Oh, it's page 5 actually.
Background
and approach to the review.
Yeah.
And what we see there is that paragraph 1, third line down, the Greenbelt review was carried out in 2013 to 2014 to assess the contribution of Greenbelt land within North Hertfordshire to the purposes of the Greenbelt as set out in what was then paragraph 80 of the NPPF. The review tests proposed development sites against Greenbelt purposes and also considers the case for designating additional Greenbelt. The Greenbelt review forms part of the evidence base in support of the emerging North Hertfordshire local plan. And can I ask you then just to go up to page 3 of that document, and we can see that that's the contents page for the document.
Yeah.
And we can see section 2, strategic review of the Greenbelt. Section 3, refined review of the Greenbelt. Section 4, analysis of villages. Section 5, analysis of potential development sites in the Greenbelt.
Yeah. And
when you've been looking at parcels 2 and 2F,
Can I ask which part, 2, 3, 4, or 5, is that located within the review itself?
It's in section 2.
Yeah.
The strategic review of the Greenbelt. And then in the refined review, ahead of any potential development sites.
Thank you. And then can I ask you to turn up PDF, same document, PDF page 33. And that is a plan of the North Hertfordshire District Council area showing the sub-parcels
Yes.
that were assessed within the Greenbelt Review. And you were asked you were asked about the rough and ready figure that you gave in evidence in chief yesterday regarding the proportion of the site that is encompassed by or that falls within parcel 2F. I'd like you to turn up your proof of evidence and Appendix 1. And the third plan in that appendix, which is a red line of the site.
Yes.
Now, could I ask you just to clarify by reference to the plan showing parcel 2F in the Greenbelt Review and the red line of the site, what is not included in 2F?
So if one looks at the land to the north east of the site in this aerial image, between the red line and Lily Bottom, that land is all excluded from the appeal site and included within 2F. The other areas of the parcel that are excluded from the site are the Heath, Tea Green, Wandon End, Wandon End House and the commercial compound opposite, and Darley Hall.
Thank you. The next point is about the East of Luton allocation, and you were asked a question around defensible boundaries and the extent to which it was considered that the East of Luton allocation would provide defensible boundaries to the Greenbelt. Can I ask you to turn up the development plan CD 4.1?
Yeah.
PDF page 100.
SP 19.
Yep. So this is policy SP 19. This is the allocation policy for the East of Luton. And if we go down to criterion B, it starts before that, before criterion A, it says development proposals should provide the following planning and master planning requirements. And at B, structural planting to create a sense of place, integration into the surrounding landscape, and to reinforce a long-term defensible greenbelt boundary to the east and mitigate landscape impacts. So what, if anything, does that aspect of the allocation policy tell us about the plan's approach to ensuring defensible boundaries, or indeed the inspector examining the plan's approach to consideration of whether the East of Luton site would have defensible greenbelt boundaries?
That it would provide a defensible greenbelt boundary to Luton through structural planting and master planning. So it of itself would be the long-term defensible boundary to Luton. And that would integrate into the surrounding landscape.
Good, thank you. And then can I ask you to turn up EN1 CD 6.2.2 by memory?
Yes, I'm there.
And you were asked, it's obviously agreed that the MPS is a material consideration. It was put to you that the closer the scheme is to the threshold, the 50 megawatt threshold, the more weight that can be attributed to the MPS. And you said, well, only where it's adding or filling voids that there could be anything more than limited weight. And subsequently, you said that you thought a very limited weight should be attached to the greenbelt aspects of the MPS. Could I ask you to turn up PDF page 6?
Yes.
And can I ask you to read out paragraph 1.2.2?
Whether policies in this MPS are material and to what extent will be judged on a case-by-case basis and will depend upon the extent to which the matters are already covered by applicable planning policy. For the purposes of applications made under the Planning Act 2008, this MPS, in conjunction with any of the relevant technology specific MPSs, are the primary policy for the Secretary of State's decision making.
Thank you. And when you were referring to adding or filling voids, is this paragraph what you had in mind or something else?
No, it was absolutely this, the extent to which matters are already covered by applicable planning policy. And that's why I was highlighting the difference in approach with the MPPF, which is more up to date, and its approach to Greenbelt policy.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Hughes. I'm sure you're very, very glad to know you can now stand down.
Thank you.
It's 1:20. If we come back at 2:15, is that all right? Or give people time for go and get some lunch? Right. Well, so 2:15, we'll resume.